My name's David Gertner. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the First Nations Studies program here at UBC. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on traditional unceded Musqueam land and thank Elder Grant for the lovely welcome that he offered us this morning. I'm very honored to work and teach and learn here on Hunkaminam Musqueam territory with language of the Hunkaminam people. We have our second panel today is on art and reconciliation. The term reconciliation has provoked a wide range of reactions in its use by the Canadian government's TRC. Some of the questions we're going to ask this afternoon is, what does this term suggest and what does it include? What are the alternatives? Where does art that addresses traumatic history sit in relation to this discussion? How do artists participate in reconciliatory practices in their artworks? Should Indigenous artists be responsible for making such gestures? This latter question is related to the relationship between art and healing, as well as in how do artworks deal with trauma, artworks that deal with trauma contribute to healing, either the artist and or the public. I was just speaking with Shelley and Larissa, and we think it's worth mentioning that we are dealing with some sensitive material here that can trigger some emotions for some people. And we just want to say to be aware that it can be an emotional engagement that we're involved in here. And just to take care of yourselves if you need to step out of the room, and also just to be aware of the people around you as well too, that we're here. I think part of this reconciliation process is supporting each other as well and being aware of your neighbor, taking good care of the neighbor. So hopefully we'll have some time in the discussion period to open that up as well. People have a chance to give voice to some of their feelings, but if we don't have room, please engage with each other, and there'll be discussion time as well. I'm going to follow Larissa's lead, and I'm going to do the introductions at the top, and then we'll do the three speakers, starting with David Garneau and then Steve Loft, and I'm closing with Charlotte Townsend-Goat. So I'll begin with David Garneau. David is an associate professor of visual arts at the University of Regina. He was born and raised in Edmonton, received most of his post-secondary education, a BFA in painting and drawing, and an MA in American literature, which brings him close to my heart, at the University of Calgary. And he's taught at the Alberta College for Art and Design for 5 years before moving to Regina in 1999. Garneau's practice includes painting, drawing, curation, and critical writing. His solo exhibition, Cowboys and Indians, bracket and Métis, toured Canada, and Roadkill toured 21 centres throughout Saskatchewan from 2009 to 2011. His work often engages issues of nature, history, masculinity, and contemporary Indigenous identities. His paintings are collected by the Canadian Museum of Civilization, the Canadian Parliament, Indian and Inuit Art Centre, the Glen Bureau Museum, the Mackenzie Art Gallery, Mendel Art Gallery, Saskatchewan Art Boards, Alberta Foundation for the Arts, Nonam, Zurich, and are in many other public and private collections. He has curated several large group exhibitions, The End of the World, bracket as we know it, Picture Windows, New Abstractions, Transcendent Squares, Contested Histories, Making It Like a Man, Graphic Visions, Textiles, two-person exhibitions, Sophisticated Folk, Reveal, Conceal, and solo shows, Diana Thornycroft, Tim Moore. Garneau has written for numerous catalog essays and reviews and was co-founder and co-editor of Artichoke and Cameo magazines. He has recently given talks in Melbourne, Adelaide, New York, San Diego, Sacramento, Saskatoon, and keynote lectures in Sydney, Toronto, Edmonton, and Sault Ste. Marie. Garneau is currently working on curatorial and writing projects featuring contemporary Indigenous art and curatorial exchanges in Canada and Australia, and is part of a 5-year SSHRC-funded curatorial research project, Creative Conciliation. And David's talk today will be called The Display and Consumption of Indigenous Pain, Empathy, and Settlement. Stephen Loft is a Mohawk of the Six Nations with Jewish heritage, a curator, scholar, writer, and media artist. In 2010, he was named Trudeau National Visiting Fellow at Ryerson University in Toronto, where he's continuing his research into Indigenous art and aesthetics. Loft has held positions as curator in residence, Indigenous art at the National Gallery of Canada, director-curator of the Urban Shaman Gallery in Winnipeg, Aboriginal curator at the Art Gallery of Hamilton, and producer and artistic director of the Native Indian / Inuit Photographers Association. He has curated group and solo exhibitions across Canada and internationally, written extensively for magazines, catalogs, and arts publications, and lectured widely in Canada and internationally. Loft co-edited Transference, Technology, Tradition, Aboriginal Media, and the New Media Art, and is now the editor of the forthcoming Coded Territories, Indigenous Pathways in New Media, which is a book of essays by artists, curators, and scholars that frames the landscapes of contemporary Aboriginal art, the influence of Western criticism and standards, and the liberating avenue of accessible technologies, including video and online media. And Stephen's talk today will be called Reconciliation. Really? And finally, Charlotte Townsend-Goat is a professor in art history and faculty associate in the Department of Anthropology here at UBC. And she's also an honorary research scholar in anthropology at the University College London. Professor Townsend-Goat has a long-standing engagement with the reception of Indigenous cultural expression, particularly in North America, and has curated Land, Spirit, Power, First Nations at the National Gallery of Canada, Yuk-Swillupton, Born to Live and Die on Your Colonial Reservations, Rebecca Belmore, The Named and the Unnamed, Backstory, Nuchalnuth, Ceremonial Curtains, and the work of Kai Kien, which was here at the Belkin Art Gallery in 2010. Dr. Townsend-Goat has also published articles in Art History, World Art Journal, Canadian Review, Cultural Studies, Canadian Journal of Communication, and Journal of Material Culture, just to name a few of the many important contributions she's made. She's also the co-editor of Bill Read and Beyond, Expanding on Modern Native Art. And she's currently working on a new book entitled Massed Relations, Display and Disguise on the Northwest Coast, and Native Art of the Northwest Coast, A History of Changing Ideas, which is co-edited with Jennifer Kramer and Kai Kien, which is really, I was saying at lunch, a truly beautiful and important text on Northwest Coast Native art, and I encourage you to have a look. It's available from UBC Press. Please join me in a warm welcome to our three speakers. 20-minute discussion talks from them, and then we'll have hopefully time for some great discussion at the end. So please join me in welcoming David Garneau up to the podium.
I'm honored by the invitation to speak here today, and honored too to be a guest on this traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Thank you very much to Elder Grant for his opening. He managed to encapsulate everything I want to say, but in a much more emotionally effective way. Really drove home a lot of points. So thank you for the Musqueam people for their hospitality and their patience. While I have positive thoughts about recent development in the relation between curation, collaboration, and Indigenous art in the so-called Reconciliation Project, 20 minutes only affords me time for critical observation. And perhaps we can talk about sunnier things at the end of the talk. I hope you don't take this the wrong way, especially the people who did the wonderful exhibition. I'm not referring to you in this one. Someone better hold Steve Loft back. 3 years ago, at a gathering of the Aboriginal Curatorial Collective at the National Gallery in Ottawa, Neil Keating discussed an exhibition he curated, Mushhole Remembered. It featured disturbing paintings and drawings by R.G. Miller Lahux. I think, what's the pronunciation of his name? Lahux. Lahux. Within minutes, some in the audience were squirming. Was it because the presenter was white and the Mohawk artist absent? Or were the folks irritated by the academic's ease with horror? The talk peaked within a comparison of the effects of Indian residential school with flesh-eating disease, complete with photographs. It was offensive. Oblivious of the callousness of his clever metaphor, the professor had to be ushered from the building. Steve, I think you had a role in that. The ACC is a mixed crowd, but during this incident, some of the Indigenous folks felt the need to separate. We went to another room to comfort a senior artist and survivor and to puzzle the meanings of what happened and what should happen next. The main hall was cleansed and the symposium resumed. But the event caused me to reflect. While indigenization and decolonization require both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal labor, these struggles also need occasions of separation, moments where Indigenous people have space and time to work things out among themselves, among ourselves, and parallel moments when allies ought to do the same. A second lesson. Colonial audiences are attracted to representations of native degradation. It's practically an academic genre. For the moment, I won't interrogate the interest of the non-Aboriginal in the Aboriginal abject. I just want to acknowledge the habit and raise a caution about why we think we exhibit Indigenous pain for non-Indigenous consumption. Do such displays lead to improvements in the lives of the people pictured, or are they conjured unconsciously to feed what Neil MacLeod describes as the insatiable hunger of the Wendigo-possessed colonizer for Indigenous flesh and resources? Keating's necrotic slideshow has me wonder if images of Native suffering, especially the mass confessions of the Truth and Reconciliation Roadshow, are staged not primarily for the benefit of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, but for the non-Indigenous and their healing. Do these displays offer reassuring evidence of the success of the colonial campaign? They're casualty reports from the slow war against the Indigenous. With their emphasis on forgiveness, these performances seem engineered to wrap up the Indian question, designed to help settlers settle consciences so they can more comfortably settle into the lands of others. Truth and reconciliation is a colonial thing. Another lesson. Neil Keating is not a curator, but an anthropologist who, out of a sense of justice, felt the need to act the part of curator. Presumably, he determined that his empathy was qualification enough to permit him to stride into this complex discourse and practice, that he felt entitled to play curator of Aboriginal art before an international gathering of Aboriginal curators was audacious and symptomatic of larger concerns about white colonial professional privilege. The colonial attitude is characterized by scopophilia, a drive to look, but also by an urge to penetrate, to traverse, to know, to translate, to own, and exploit. The attitude assumes that everything should be accessible to those with the desire, the will, and the means to access them. Everything is ultimately comprehensible, a potential commodity, resource, or salvage. The academic branch of this enterprise collects and analyzes the experience and things of others, transforms story into text, and objects in relation into artifacts to be cataloged and stored or exhibited. This is a form of resource exploitation, of course. The primary sites of Indigenous resistance, then, are not the rare open battles between colonized and the dominant, but the everyday active refusals of complete engagement with the agents of exploitation and assimilation. This includes speaking one's own way with one's own people, refusing translation and full explanations, and refusing to be a native informant. It really makes me think of Rebecca's work and how loath she is to explain it, to talk about it, to talk at all. Indigenous noncompliance, particularly the refusal of many Indian residential survivors to participate in official healing, signals the need for creative representations away from the current reconciliation narrative. Art and curation have a role in reconciliation. The question is whether it is to aid assimilation or Indigenous sovereignty. Most know the words by Duncan Campbell Scott, poet, deputy, and superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 32, and champion of the Indian residential schools as the final solution to the Indian problem. His words. He wrote, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. There's no Indian question and no Indian department. The Indian problem is the inconvenience to white expansionism, capitalism, and patriarchy of having the original keepers of these territories continue to exist, continue to resist assimilation, and continue to insist on maintaining traditional relationships among themselves and the land. You may also know this, the first sentence on the Truth and Reconciliation Mandate webpage. There is an emerging and compelling desire to put the events of the past behind us so we can work towards a stronger and healthier future. And you should note, I sort of made it in a little bit of blue. The second part is a wish, right? That's not part of the mandate. The part of the mandate is the first part of that sentence. Well, the source of this compelling desire is not cited. Many Indigenous people would agree. Who wouldn't want to put the bad things behind them so they can move forward? But what if the compelling desire that fuels the TRC machine is not an Indigenous, but a colonial ache? Then this enterprise is assimilation by fresh means. From Confederation in the Indian Act through Scott in the Indian Residential School era, Canada's desire has been to absorb into the body politic those First Nations, Métis and Inuit, it could not starve or discourage to death. To make them Canadian, no different than their fellow citizens. The goal of this colonial project is the Canadianization of Indigenous peoples, a process that will eventually render us into folks with interesting heritages, but no collective rights or claim on this land and no say in its stewardship. Imagining non-colonial curatorial practices in a post-truth and reconciliation era requires a shift of imagining reconciliation to living conciliation, a shift from managing Indigenous art and bodies within dominant culture visual narratives to converting colonial exhibition spaces into Indigenous sovereign display territories, and a shift from allies as silent witnesses to allies as active collaborators. Now, I don't want to offend the extraordinary people who have participated and were healed by, or were just happy to participate in the TRC sessions, but it's important to consider the peculiar display mechanisms that shape their sharing. This sanctioned performance of reconciliation is foundationally skewed. Testimony produced for the Commission is constrained by non-Indigenous narratives of closure, by Western religious ideology, by an emphasis on individuals over communities, by the public display of victims but not perpetrators, and by the degrading and corrupting influence of cash for testimony. As a result, not all stories are welcome, and not everyone is interested in engaging in this often humiliating theater. What is discouraged? Rage, the refusal to forgive, the naming of names, the details of intergenerational effects, the use of Indigenous people in the schools as agents of oppression, the formation and deformation of masculinity in those places, talking about what happened to the payout money and how it distorts individuals, families, and communities, and so on. We, artists, academics, curators, anyone else similarly empowered or burdened, must begin transformation by reconsidering the thoughts and behaviors the concept reconciliation constructs. Conciliation is the action of bringing into harmony. It's an extrajudicial process that is the conversion of a state of hostility or distrust, the promotion of goodwill by kind and considerate measures, and peaceable or friendly union. The word calls to mind the meeting of two previously separated parties through an amicable process into a mutually satisfying relationship. Reconciliation is a seeming synonym with a difference. Reconciliation refers to the repair of previously existing harmonious relationships. In the present situation, this word imposes the fiction that there was universal peace between Indigenous people and Canada. Now, it's true for many generations after contact, some Indigenous peoples had good relations with some Europeans. The troubles began when visitors became settlers, when traders were replaced by ever-increasing waves of colonists, when invading nations decided they'd rather own the well than share the water. This reached a crescendo when this part of Turtle Island became Rupert's Land and then Canada, without negotiations with the traditional keepers. The word reconciliation creates a false understanding of our past and constricts our sense of future. Reconciliation claims that there was a prior time of general conciliation, that this peace was tragically disrupted by the Indian residential schools and will be painfully restored through reconciliation. The imagined conciliation before reconciliation may refer to the post-Confederation numbered treaties. However well extensive most of this territory in Quebec were not covered, and the Métis are not treaty people. Treaties are very important, but their uneven nature, their continuous violation, trouble any notion of prior universal resolution between Indigenous people in Canada. Repetition of the word reconciliation in the present time is the expression of a colonial wish that there truly was a past comprehensive settlement that would make our shared future ethically bearable. Settlement was not an agreement between First Nations and Canada. It was not the treaties, and it was not conciliatory, but it was universal. It was the imposition of the Indian Act in 1876. Reconciliation conjures images of halcyon moments prior conciliation as the site of national origin. It pictures the Indian residential school era as an unfortunate deviation rather than just another aspect of the perpetual struggle to contain and control Aboriginal people, territories, and resources. The present colonial desire is to put the events of the past behind us and reconcile Aboriginal people with this healing narrative. The reconciliation narrative anesthetizes knowledge of pre-contact Aboriginal sovereignty and creates in settlers' minds the sense that Indigenous people are Canadians like them, that they came into being with Canada, that they are now simply a minority interest group rather than pre-existing hosts and the partners who make this place possible. Especially from the point of view of the Indigenous leaders who signed in good faith, treaties were nation-to-nation conciliations. Treaties recognized the pre-existing and ongoing sovereignty of conciliatory parties. And as Ryan was giving, I can't find an equivalent in the prairies, and I apologize for borrowing this from your territory, Ryan, but it's so eloquent. So this understanding is figured in the two-row treaty wampum belts. Two boats, in this case a British ship and an Iroquois canoe, go down the river of life together but do not touch. Two communities live parallel to each other, trade, but do not violate each other's core space and customs. Two states establish a neutral space of negotiation between their communities in which general conciliation is established as a living agreement, a relationship that does not compromise each other's core spaces. Conciliation is not the erasure of difference or the erasure of sovereignty. Conciliation is not assimilation. So why this word? Reconciliation is a sacrament in the Catholic Church. It follows confession and penance. Reconciliation is the reunion of a person to the Church. According to the Vatican, those who approach the sacrament I should say I'm a Catholic, and I've got an uncle who's a bishop, an aunt who's a nun. My mom tried to join, they kicked her out. And then she married a Jesuit priest. So I can't help but read this through Catholic eyes. So according to the Vatican, those who approach the sacrament of penance obtain pardon from God's mercy for the offense committed against him and are at the same time reconciled with the Church, which they have wounded by their sins, and which by charity, by example, and by prayer labors for their conversion. Reconciliation assumes that the parties were once in harmony through the contracts of baptism, confirmation, and communion, and only through reconciliation can stasis be restored. Beyond the pale of reconciliation is the possibility that the Church could be wrong. Individuals are faulty in need of reformation, never the Church. The Church is a static archetype. People are imperfect beings who variously move toward or away from that perfect Platonic universal. This imaginary informs Canada's Truth and Reconciliation journey. The relationship is individual to state rather than nation to nations or person to person negotiations of a conciliation or treaty model. The system requires individual accounts, but it's the one sinned upon who has to make the confession. It's the one sinned upon who has to give forgiveness. The system requires individual confessions and healing narratives, Perversely, it is the sinned upon who make confession, not the perpetrators. While it acknowledges that the abuses were the result of past systemic policy, Canada does not do anything that would risk the integrity of current dominant structures, because the system is premised on assimilation. It is cautious about recognizing that it is in a perpetual relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and so it imposes a time limit on healing. Though I hear it's been extended by a year. It also pays off individuals rather than recognize that harms were also done to collectives and intergenerational wholes. The imagined end of this restoration project is, as the advertising claims, Canada's truth and reconciliation journey. Truths are told, the destroyed are mourned, the broken repaired, individual natives reconciled with Canada, and the national identity endures. Now you can imagine that those who were removed from their culture, language, and spiritual traditions, and who were indoctrinated by religious Indian residential schools would slide rather easily into this similar confessional narratives of the TRC. And that those who retained or regained their cultural and spiritual practice are the ones likely to resist. Government ideology and funding has created a spectacle of the Indian residential school experience as a means to distract from larger issues. It reduces colonialism into a soluble problem. The schools are closed, the victims are paid off, problem solved, now shut up. We need to challenge this narrative. To use another Catholic metaphor, forced assimilation is the original sin that made Canada possible. This is the settler's inheritance and the immigrant's burden. Colonialism is not a singular historical event, but an ongoing legacy, a relationship. The colonizer has not left. While official Canada is engaged in a race to a post-historical space called reconciliation, we must reconcile ourselves to a permanent state of negotiation, of treaty, of conciliation. Conciliation is the mutual beneficial coming together of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who are working towards indeterminate futures. Exhibitions of Indigenous art constructed within a dominant culture space are always informed by the worldviews of their managers. And if we are working towards conciliation, we should start, as Steve Loft might say, by asking for the keys. When non-Aboriginal institutions and curators consider exhibitions about Indian residential schools or Indigenous art generally, things are changing, but still, they rarely imagine simply stepping aside and inviting Indigenous professionals to do the work. Aboriginal sovereign display territories are permanent institutions or temporary exhibitions, site-specific installations, interventions, and performances that are completely authored by Indigenous people. But rather than just have native bodies occupy white positions and attitudes, institutions and methods are reimagined. Picture this: Aboriginal curators who are not under the supervision of non-Indigenous collaborators. Imagine non-Aboriginal curators questioning their ability to curate everything and everyone. And Aboriginal curators creating exhibitions about something other than indigeneity. And even curating non-Aboriginal art and artists. Imagine creative conciliation, exhibitions of art produced by non-Indigenous artists who explore their colonial inheritance. Recent immigrants negotiating their inherited burden. Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal collaborative installations and performances about the environment, masculinity, love, food, hockey, anything but race and culture alone. These are moments of conciliation where things are not displayed as lessons, but presented as sites of working out, working through. I can't even talk about this one without crying, so I'm not going to. Perfect example, Sandra, Skeena, and also Ayumi, Peter Morin. Creative conciliation requires protocols of engagement. Curators need to be cautious, for example, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. Have to be cautious not to replicate a truth and reconciliation model unconsciously. Our less enfranchised partners must be engaged as agents and not subjects. Our work should not be about Indigenous people, but a study with Indigenous people. We must especially watch that our creative partners are not participating due to economic deprivation, selling the final commodity the dominant culture is interested in accumulating, their stories. Allies must understand the historical and embodied facts to the satisfaction of the first peoples they hope to work with. However, even before such engagements, non-Aboriginal people should first examine among themselves their motives and be able to explain their need to engage this work. We should not be in such a rush to let our words imagine a reconciled, healed future. Our focus should be on creating the conditions that engender the sharing of experience and imagining futures in forms that cannot be easily appropriated, measured, and contained. Thank you.
I just want to thank David and all the speakers so far. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot to reflect on, and I think this is very important, these kinds of gatherings. I just want to say Sego, bring my greetings, words of friendship to the Musqueam Nation, to thank their community, their elders, their ancestors for the right to speak here today. What a strange phenomenon that the very strange phenomenon of the decimation and dispossession of indigenous inhabitants of two entire continents is not considered, well, strange. In fact, it is hardly ever considered at all, at the very most as a great adventure on the part of Europeans. Jimmy Durham wrote that. I want to talk about history, rage, and reconciliation. But I also want to talk about some images. I want to tell you about this image. It's a very disturbing image for me, and I think for many people. The man's name in the beret is Davin Calfchild. This was on November 13th. There was a Remembrance Day ceremony in Toronto, downtown Toronto. Happens every year. There's a parade, some speakers. Everybody gets very nationalistic and patriotic. And for the last several years, Davin and two friends have been coming down. He is a veteran. He fought for the Canadian Forces. He comes down with an Iroquois Haudenosaunee flag, the Hiawatha Belt flag, to bring an Aboriginal presence, an Indigenous presence to this very important ceremony, an important ceremony for him, certainly as someone who fought, an important ceremony for the nation state that prides itself, rightly or wrongly, on its military history. An important time to reflect on sacrifice, sovereignty. So he comes down with his flag, and this year he was confronted by the police, who told him that he was disturbing the peace. A public ceremony in a public place honoring men and women just like him, and he was disturbing the peace. He was arrested for disturbing the peace. The flag he was carrying was thrown to the ground by the police and later stepped on and stomped on by several people in the crowd. I can't imagine a more disturbing image than that as Aboriginal people. And it made me reflect on the issues we were going to be talking about today. And I want to thank David again for reminding us what reconciliation is. And in this simplistic view of an idea of restitution, of somehow restoring a harmony that once existed. And also telling us about its Christian framework as well. But this idea that we have achieved a place, a time, a moment where we may be able to have reconciliation, I think is part of the national myth. And it's one that needs to be challenged and, in my view, completely taken off the table. Instead, I like to talk about disturbing the image. And here we have another case of confrontation, this time between the Canadian military and a Mohawk warrior at Oka. What's different, you ask? Two things. One is that the warrior is not being taken away in handcuffs. He's standing proudly for his nation and for his beliefs. The other is that this image was taken by Alanisa Bomswan. And through her film, there are many films, but this film, Ganasatake 270 Years of Resistance, she disturbs the image. Linda Tuai Smith says, non-Indigenous history is an invention of dominant society, written to exclude Indigenous values and view while claiming to be an objective and accurate portrayal of the chronology of events, when in reality it is a tool of domination. And I'm going to back up a bit here right now and talk about positionality. As some of you know, most of you don't, I've just recently taken a position with the Canada Council for the Arts, which is a federal agency, an arm's length agency. So now I work for the fucking government. Puts me in a bit of an odd position. On one level, I'd like to, if my if my employers are listening in on this webcast, I'd like to assure them that I won't call for general revolution and the deaths of all those who now pay my way. But I do want to say that for me, being Indigenous is a daily, active position of resistance. And we must demand positionality. And it's important that we do take positions within structures that have and continue to oppress us and have presence, but that we demand that we also have voice within those structures. And I think that's only then can we get to a place where we can say we might be able to achieve some form of conciliation. We're not there yet. Jimmy Durham also wrote, all photographs of American Indians are photographs of dead people, in that their use assumes ownership of the subject, which is seen as static and completely understandable. Here's another image from Ganasatake 270 Years of Resistance. I just wanted to start talking about this idea of where we exist in relation to the nation state known as Canada. And for me, it'll always be epitomized by this image. We are on different sides of a barrier. We're on the same land. And whether that barrier between us is razor wire, legislation, or the larger attitudes that people have towards us, that gulf exists, and we can't seem to bridge it. What I want to do is talk a bit about ideas of rage and reconciliation, but I also want to explore ways in which artists have and continue to manifest what I like to call an aesthetic of resistance. For me, Aboriginal art is innately political. It's the culmination of lived experiences from pre-contact customary societies through the colonial enterprise. It is tied up in histories that include both pre- and post-contact epistemologies. Their narratives empowered by continuity, inextricably linked, and it is the assertion of cultural autonomy and sovereignty. And Teresa Harlan writes, creating a visual history and its representations from native memories or from Western myths. This is the question before native image makers and photographers today. The contest remains over who will image and own this history. Before too many assumptions are made, we must define history, define whose history it is, and define its purpose, as well as the tools used for the telling of it. The intent of history is to help us keep our bearings. That is, to know what is significant, and most importantly, to teach us how to recognize the significant. What happens when history is skewed, or when we no longer have the same skills of recognition? We as human beings become disabled by the inability to distinguish what is real from what is not. Indigenous art is not predicated on colonialism. What do I mean by this? At first glance, it would seem counterintuitive. Colonialism has been the cause of the suffering, oppression, and violence perpetuated against Aboriginal people in this and many other countries for centuries. But attributing the rise of resistance, activism, and the art associated with it to colonialism itself is disingenuous. Societies and the people in them are changed by events. It is the interactions of people which manifest the destructive ideologies inherent in colonialism. And as David Garneau reminded us, apparently this nation has no history of colonialism, when in fact it has a long, decidedly brutal, violent, and oppressive history of not only colonialism, but genocide. So reconciliation, really? I don't think Bob Boyer would think so. This is his piece, A Minor Sport in Canada. And I think it epitomizes the kind of relationship that he saw Indigenous people having with the colonial powers, and it continues to this day. This is an image from 1862, from the Dakota War, also known as the Sioux Uprising. It was an armed conflict between the United States and several bands of the Eastern Sioux, also known as the Eastern Dakota. And it began on August 17, 1862, and ended with a mass execution of 38 Dakota men on December 26, 1862, in a place called Mankato, Minnesota. And before we get too smug as Canadians, shortly after the Riel Rebellion of 1884-85, the government of Sir John A. Macdonald moved quickly to suppress any possible further uprising by the Indian nations. In a move designed to, and I quote, convince the red man that the white man governs, unquote, Macdonald ordered the show trials of Indians perceived to have helped Riel. Leaders such as Poundmaker and Big Bear were imprisoned, even though evidence clearly showed they had not risen up against the state. And on November 27, 1885, the largest mass hanging in Canada's history took place at Fort Battleford, Saskatchewan, when 6 Cree and 2 Assiniboine men were tried for murder and publicly executed within the walls of the stockade. The day the hangings took place, all the Indian students at the Battleford Industrial School were taken out to witness the event. The reason for this was to remind them what would happen if one made trouble with the Crown, and to provide a lasting reminder of the white man's power and authority. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, no photographs of the hanging are known to exist. These are the kinds of events that colonialism makes happen. These are the things that we have to remember. Unfortunately, this is how it's remembered. This is how the state remembers events. They put up monuments. They memorialize it. And I would argue that what this does is diminish the event. It doesn't sear it into the psyche. It says, and again I refer to David, it takes that out. It sanitizes it because we've put up some kind of monument, because we've put up a memorial. That assuages guilt. It's a very Euro-Western concept and a construct that I find really appalling. And unfortunately, I have to say the same about this idea of reconciliation and a reconciliation commission. I am all for truth and truth-telling and speaking truth to power. But you don't get beyond what happened by creating something that, as David very articulately said, cleanses the state of any responsibility. That is not reconciliation. That's forgetting. That's erasure. And if you put a little monument at the side of the road, somehow you don't have to worry about it anymore. James Luna, in the artifact piece. I think, for me, looking back on some of these images, I've taken a bunch of images just of artists I love, just to, to show you. And this piece was about a lot of things, but when I was thinking about this, I thought, yeah, that's what this piece was about as well. He becomes the memorial there, yet he's living, as are the Aboriginal people, Aboriginal nations, and the survivors of not just residential schools, because that wasn't the only event. It was horrific. It was awful. But it wasn't the only one. Mankato, Battleford, Oka, the list goes on and on. So this idea that some commission is going to then wipe the slate clean is bizarre. This is Big Bear in chains. And this is Jeff Thomas's work, Culture Revolution. Now that is a monument to our strength, our vitality, our dynamism as people. And this I would argue is where we should be at least putting some of our effort and some of our attention into what our artists are saying. Everything's encapsulated in this image. That's Jeff's young son Bear, that young then, now he's huge, wearing the hat with the E.S. Curtis image on it, and finding this piece of graffiti there. Culture, revolution, that to me is monumental. That's Bear a little older. Again, this taking of the Aboriginal image and trivializing it, and you can see in the picture behind Bear, the sports teams in Ottawa, where I live right now, there's been a big thing about the Nepean Redskins. In the States, Washington Redskins, that has come up yet again. This has been decades that Aboriginal people have been trying to get these things torn down because it trivializes and negates our presence. This is Wounded Knee. I'll read you something. Where did you go, Paul? I apologize. Paul Chatt-Smith writes, "See, we only became Indians once the armed struggle was over in 1890. Before then, we were Shoshone, or Mohawk, or Crow. For centuries, North America was a complicated, dangerous place full of shifting alliances between the United States and Indian nations, among the Indian nations themselves, and between the Indians in Canada, Mexico, and half of Europe. This happy and confusing time ended forever that December morning of a century ago, Wounded Knee. Once we no longer posed a military threat, we became Indians, all of us more or less identical in practical terms. The truth is that we didn't know a damn thing about being Indian. This information was missing from our original instructions. We had to figure it out as we went along. The new century beckoned. Telegraphs, telephone, movies, the building blocks of mass culture were in place or being invented. These devices would fundamentally change life on the planet. This idea that we became less than what we had been. And that was perpetuated, of course, through the media, this new invention. This was an image that was shown widely in newspapers at the time, as was this. This is Chief Bigfoot as he died with over 300 men, women, and children on that day at Wounded Knee. This is an event. This changed who we are. It didn't end who we were. It did change us. This is Rebecca Belmore's piece, Blanket. It's a video installation. This is it's shown in Winnipeg at the Plug-in Institute of Contemporary Art. And what Rebecca's done in the beautiful articulate way that she does is she shows the history of the blanket and colonialism in a way that makes us think about this relationship and these events. The blanket was an important trade item at the beginning. There was a nation-to-nation relationship. There was conciliatory relationship, trade. But that all started to change. And as value for furs and dependence on the whites increased, the blanket, colonialism, becomes more restrictive. Until at the end, of course, the same death as Bigfoot. This is, I'll go through these quickly now, because I'm probably nearing the end of my time. Again, another image, because if you can't kill them off, starve them off, take away their livelihood, the buffalo in this case. This is one small mound of buffalo skulls. And this is Dana Claxton's amazing performance and installation work, Buffalo Bone China. Of course, you know, the bones were used for China when she dissembles it and creates her own mound of the bones, and the video that goes with it. The second Wounded Knee, where members of the American Indian movement were called into the Pine Ridge Reservation to help keep peace in that community. But of course, if you get Indians with guns, we all of a sudden become the enemy, the terrorists, the other, the dangerous other. So what do? They send in the FBI. Shots were fired, people died, 2 Aboriginal people died, 1 FBI agent, and Leonard Peltier was arrested in Canada. 3 years later, he's now still serving whether 2 consecutive life sentences in a penitentiary in the United States, and even the American authorities concede that they had no evidence against him. But in the words of one attorney general, someone had to pay. This is a self-portrait of Leonard. Yes, residential schools. Yes, we do need to talk about it. We need to see it through the eyes of the people who went through it. And I honor those who tell their stories. I honor those who are willing to tell us what really happened, to tell the truth. I honor that. But I have to tell you, this is not a spectacle for the Canadian people. This is not some way to assuage guilt. And we will not be a spectacle for you. And I thank Adrian Stimson, as always. Carl Beam. Robert Houle, Sandy Bay. I love and am so saddened by this painting. And Robert has, you know, I think so eloquently captured his experience in residential school and beyond in this way. The photographs, the painting of the school, fading slightly but still such a powerful presence for him. The demarcation, something happened, and then back to what he's so known for, his oeuvre, the abstraction that's so vibrant, so alive. Yes, it has been affected. Absolutely, it has been changed irrevocably. But he is who he is. We are who we are. We're still proud. We're still strong. We're different. And I think that that's our strength, is our adaptability. Colonialism, contact, residential schools, genocide, it did not destroy us. It changed us. But we are still Indians. But even more than that, going back to Chat Smith, we are Shoshone and Crow and Mohawk, which is what I am and what I will always be. And I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me.
But of course I also want to acknowledge the Musqueam. So my talk's a little oblique, but maybe that's all right. In Lisa Jackson's remarkable film Savage, Skeena Reese, the mother in her kitchen, performs the utterly inexplicable absence of her daughter by singing a lullaby. Reese's other appearance in Witnesses, Touch Me, which we've already heard about here, takes on the equally inexplicable presence of the other, the white woman. Is that really little? Yeah. Maybe not that little. Is it? Okay, the equally inexplicable presence of the other, the white woman. If this is the washing of tears, nothing is washed away. Both performer and spectator are locked together on a beam. So I'm talking really about performance here. And I'm calling it Being There or Not, Native Performance Art, a perspective. Performance involves at minimum a performer and a spectator. The relationship between them is seldom a simple one, as between the active performer and the passive audience. Performance art puts the emphasis on being there, on embodied presence rather than just looking. The perspective on native performance art that I'm taking here is that the spectator, literally a person with a perspective, is part of the action, implicated, becomes a participant. The point is that the artist makes this move as an invitation of sorts that means something in social and political terms. Luna's artifact piece confounded the distinction between looking and being there. It has acquired iconic status precisely because this icon, this particular museum Indian, could eventually get up and walk away. It was the audience who were trapped. An invitation to participate in the process may also be a rebuke. Luna's invitation ridiculed the trope of the safely dead Indian, as we've just heard. Native performance artists often play with signs of nativeness, but equally they play with their audiences, who read and misread the signs. They're playing to the issues, social, political, economic, embedded in the signs, and so to the ontological disjuncture, the essential difference inherent in native-non-native relations. Often their performances are about the tormented process of defining native and art, and the blur between performing self and performing culture. The blurring has only been speeded up on the internet. Now it seems easier to emphasize performance rather than the disagreed upon definitions of art. Inventive energy, unforgotten history, wit, art world savvy, but not an overdose, and paradox distinguish native performance art. It's a paradoxical form. Life is a performance, history is a public secret. Audiences may be native or naive, neither or both. Having a perspective on any of this is a little misleading, since perspective has to do with seeing, and much more than sight is activated. But since, for one reason or another, any perspective is likely to be warped, the attempt here is to take up some of the paradox evident in 4 different performances across a 20-year span by 4 very different artists. I'm going to have to read more quickly, I see. Getting at some of the contradictions might involve asking whether you had to be there at a performance in order to have a response, noticing a blurring effect between the performance of self and performance art, taking into account the material traces left after a performance, and wanting to know about the spectators, who they were expected to be and what was expected of them. And to whose edicts do you turn to frame such provocations? Gerald Visner, Jolene Rickard, Jimmy Durham, Paul Chatt-Smith, David Garneau, Amelia Jones, Jacques Rancière, Taiyaki Alfred, or those of the artists themselves. Most people will not have actually attended the performances for which they are the intended audience, although they might wish that they had. In Performance, Live or Dead, art historian Amelia Jones suggests that it might be better if you were not there, since if presence is required, then performance has a very limited sort of afterlife. The interesting thing is that you may have somehow acquired a memory of it anyway. This point, Jones connects with the renewed interest in Henri Bergson's definition of memory, not as a carbon copy of what happened, but rather as an accumulation that builds up after the fact. So it's entirely possible to remember something only heard about from those who were present, or seen by observing the traces, some record or archive, and perhaps Wounded Knee falls into that category. I've chosen these performances not because I was there, but because, like most people, for most of them I was not, and yet in Bergsonian memory, each reinstates a precarious moment, presses on a historical flashpoint, exposes a politico-social taboo, reformats a cultural protocol. Given what is at stake in relations across cultures, they were or are moments of heightened alert. In 1994, Neil Eustache had a show at the Grunt Gallery in Vancouver, and he called it, "How Can Save What's Leaved My Culture and Still Make a Living Off of It?" At its opening, with his own work on the walls, Eustache was at first present as himself. Then he disappeared. A bit later, unrecognizable in his disguise, he stumbled through the opening night crowd, run down, intoxicated, and wearing cheap street Indian clothes. Acting quietly obnoxious, he had turned himself into a performer, and everyone else into spectators, knowing spectators, even emancipated spectators of the street Indian. Rancière develops the idea of the emancipated spectator who already knows what she is being shown or told, and thus evades the trap set by a simplistic distinction between teacher and taught, between knowing and not knowing. The audience for anything native in Vancouver, probably elsewhere, is in a double bind, being simultaneously free, emancipated in Rancière's sense, and trapped. Performance is not so much revelatory as a reinstatement of the already known. The next step is to know what to do about it. Indistinguishable from the real thing, Eustache was being and being regarded as the street Indian. It emerged, however, that this figure was performing the real thing, not being it, and then later that the identifying costume could be sold. By redirecting audience attention from the show and the chatter, he shifted the opening night dynamic, triangulated everyone's reasons for being there, and rearranged the relationship between being and performing. So the switch between being Eustache, Indian artist, and Eustache performing street Indian was the subject of the performance. It was a quasi-impromptu détournement, activating and inverting some of the social processes which simultaneously devalue and value the native. But actually, Eustache was not thinking of Guy Debord and situationism so much as of Buster Keaton and vaudeville. He had done what he calls live shows before, he says, but I thought I wouldn't make it past 30, and so I didn't take them very seriously. This time he wanted to think about what would happen to a character formed by the Indian residential school experience, who, as he puts it, in essence, rather than in some parallel representational sense, wandered off the reserve, off the street, into the gallery, mumbling but coherent, mingling with an audience, some of whom might have known nothing of that experience and had to listen. Might it have made the audience uncomfortably aware of what they did not know, even as they congratulated themselves on being there? Different kinds of knowledge were up against each other, staring each other in the face that night. All that remains of Eustache's intrusion into conventional gallery decorum are the clothes that costumed his other self. I started remembering this performance when I saw a photograph of the clothes, professionally conserved, neatly folded in acid-free tissue in an archival box. The costume had been purchased on the spot for the permanent collection of UBC's Belkin Art Gallery by the prescient Scott Watson. By virtue of having been, the director of the gallery, in case you don't know, by virtue of having been sold by the artist, they are the authorized memory, while two questions, what exactly will be remembered and what exactly was sold, come together in one Anglo-French word, souvenir. Eustache ridicules the troublesome relationship between art and commodity by adding the term Indian and then stuffing it with his own cheap clothes, his costume. The memory asks, if an Indian doing it makes it Indian art, then what part of the Indian goes on sale? In 1988, the predicament of culture was famously identified by cultural historian James Clifford as the point where maintaining a border around the distinctiveness of a culture clashes with a mixed-up world. The term that might now be a better fit is ontological predicament, the individual's way of being rather than a culture's way of knowing. As inside or outsider, Eustache was performing Vancouver's variant on the ontological predicament. The street person up against the art crowd, the unacceptable up against those who the system somehow or other accepts, the exception to the system that the system has itself created. But the outside-inside disposition shifts when insiders want to buy into outsider status. The box of street clothes as commodity and archive nails these contradictory values rather neatly. Is Eustache blurring the vital distinction between the performance of self and the staged performance? This blur might be the distinguishing feature of much native performance, reaching into the audience's own performed lives. Anyway, the end result is that there is native art for sale, so as far as this artist is concerned, he gets the last laugh. Dana Clatson's photograph, Jingle Dress No. 1, dated 1989 to 2012, is performance become tableau. In this photograph, a dancer in a jingle dress stands with her back to the camera in half light, in the center of the image, ready and waiting to perform. Confident enough to have her back to the camera, she refuses to be caught in a fugitive pose, Gerald Wisner's term for the imagery of false consciousness. Cultural pageantry, dioramas and museum presentations pictured the fugitive Indian in the archives of dominance, he wrote. The jingle dance, rhythmically noisy once in motion, since the fringes of the buckskin dress are hung with hundreds of metal decorations made from the crimped lids of chewing tobacco cans, is an important part of the contemporary powwow. As is often the case in her work, Claxton wants an audience to understand enough about at least some aspect of her cultural ceremonial life to know that it may be spectacular, but that it's something else as well. The dancer is surrounded by a mass of enabling technology: lights, screens, recording devices, spools of cable, people sitting at consoles or arranging the gear. They're all men, which will enable both performance and its recording. The camera captures the dancer's composure and her anticipation while being protected by the apparatus of production, in the sense proposed by Foucault and taken up by Giorgio Agamben. And then there are the luminous screens that loom over the dancer. It's not necessarily clear whether they are screens for projection, devices to disperse the lights, to hide the equipment, or to distinguish stage from backstage. The photograph makes dignified play on Freud's screen memory. Are these screens for projection or for protection? Or do they screen off and obliterate memory of powwow dancing in a totally different setting? The apparatus guarantees the record, the memory, the possibility of reenactment of older dance forms that have morphed to integrate new materials. It screens historical devastation and political outrage with lyricism and luminosity. All that remains of the performance, of a moment of calm before the performance, of quiet before the jingling starts, is a photograph. The dancer is poised for action, but now her silent jingle dress quietens the scene, which is tense with the anticipation that when she moves, all that will change. Dancer and dress will act together. The performer's movement will activate the entire space. This is affect in anticipation. Paradoxically, as stilled action, Jingle Dress No. 1 calls up Luna's artifact piece with its enduring power to meld objectification and subjectivity. But the point of photographs recording that performance was to show Indian action deadened. Just that tension between action and inaction is in Jingle Dress. The dancer is waiting for a sign from the apparatus around her, which will allow or animate what the museum apparatus around Luna had taken away. Most people will only know Jingle Dress and the artifact piece through their photographs. The record of a performance becomes a tableau, and in both works, Althusser's use of apparatus comes into play, bringing with it the ideological issues that underlie indigenous systems of signification, inseparable from the moves made by native artists now. Other performances which have left enduring tableau would include, and I don't have a photograph, I'm sorry, of Shelley Nero's Marvelous Mohawk Women, and this is Rebecca Belmore's exhibit number 671B from 1988. You remember this was part of the protest against the Spirit Sings and Shell Oil's patronage of that exhibition. In all these cases, the performance has been caught in the freeze frame, which will make the memory for most people and make its history. Rancière argued that certain kinds of photographs, which he terms tableaux, extend and revive the tradition of history painting. Take back might be the apt term, in the way that Kent Monkman's paintings take back that tradition. The tableau mode works differently in Belmore's Against Glass. The title is Against Glass and then in brackets diorama. But like Jingle Dress number 1, it involves the recorded trace of performance, reassembled precisely to act as an aide-memoire. Belmore knows her art history, her Western art history. She's made a cabinet of curiosities, even her own little boîte en valise, assembling a kind of summary of 3 of her own works, revisiting them, putting them into new relationships. It was partly this revisiting or reformation that gave Marcel Duchamp's 1938 boîte en valise its legendary status in 20th century art history. Return and reenactment is a central preoccupation of performance art now, and connects with Diana Taylor's distinction between the archive and the repertoire. In reassembling her own memory fragments, Belmore makes an object that is a record, a sculpture that is its own plinth, out of 2 projections of earlier performances, an ambient soundtrack, the national anthem. I think it's the national anthem of Britain. I think it's God Save Our Queen, right, is it? Can anybody help me with that? I don't think it's O Canada, sorry. And a phalanx of Indian chess pieces, chiefs, braves, shamans, Indian princesses, debased, it goes without saying, poised to play across the shimmering surface projection from inside the box. Beside the chess pieces, a tiny screen replays her work Victorious of 2008, while Hyde of 2010 projects from below. Memory may indeed be fuzzy and flickering. She condenses the essence of these works into the surface projections of the box. Belmore's play on the metaphor of box as a holder of memory, plays on the metaphor of box as a holder of memory, although this box, this plinth, is all exterior. Its surface are strictly external sites for projection. So in these ways, she's playing herself into an art world with moves not so different from a game of chess. The artist a pawn in somebody's game. Rather than reiterating the claims often made for her work, she puts the whole operation of ideological signification into question, a game of chess played across uncertain and competing force fields. Synopsis, record, aide-memoire, the archive replaying itself, with point of view as slippery as memory itself. And this is my last example. Bodick is going to break a copper. The idea, this is not Bodick, the idea as it hits the social media in early 2013 sends a frisson. Breaking a copper in public will either break a taboo or set a new precedent, or both. There were questions about status, rights and correct protocols around this unprecedented public enactment of a chiefly move to which an object, its object, doubling as the objective of the ceremony is central. The presence, the implication of an audience, is not necessarily an endorsement. The performance ceremony, rather than being central to a potlatch, was to be the culmination of a walk from Alert Bay, the home of the Namkish people, to an Idle No More rally in Victoria. The intent was to draw attention to the plight of the West Coast salmon and to protect fish farming, amongst other causes. The ceremonial breaking of a copper has always been intended to impress in Kwakwaka'wakw society. It would enhance the power of its chiefly owner, the broken copper a paradoxical sign of the wholeness of the lineage. The shape of the beaten copper is not easy to describe, nor apparently to account for historically, but the material gleams like the ruddy scales of a salmon. It's the ultimate Kwakwaka'wakw symbol of wealth and status, an impressive object at the apogee of a value system, part of that extended cultural performance, the potlatch. The image, this one, that goes out on Facebook, superimposes a famous Edward Curtis photograph of a Kwakwaka'wakw chief holding a copper against the ornate colonial architecture of the legislature in Victoria. Like the former courthouse in the centre of Vancouver, now the Vancouver Art Gallery, these neoclassical buildings administered the laws that defined and controlled native lives, that outlawed potlatching and confiscated coppers. It cannot be an incidental irony that today's imperious performance attaches itself to the building's imperious status. On YouTube, Bodick talks about his plan and describes the gestures historically prescribed. And then a video is posted to YouTube almost instantly, showing the ceremonial cutting taking place in the midst of a group of people in regalia. Some of the participants were making the moves and the sounds associated with a hamatsa. Once, amongst the closely guarded rituals of Kwakwaka'wakw, performed only by those with inherited rights to do so, the hamatsa with its masks and moves is becoming the public face of the culture. Similarly, by going public through the auspices of a respected native artist, the copper breaking opens up long withheld and long protected ceremony, arguably expanding the idea of native art. But in what sense is a traditional copper breaking a ceremony or a performance? That it requires some sophistry to make the distinction reinforces the idea that performing native and native performance are tricky to separate. To answer the question, do you turn to Kwakwaka'wakw definitions of ceremony or to definitions of performance current in contemporary art? Hal Foster and others, Hal Foster, contemporary art historian, and others identify some idea of ritual as being central to modernist performance art. There's a whole literature about that. Since these versions do not exactly mesh, do you turn to the idea of the two-row wampum, which we've heard about already today, as worked through by Alan Michelson, for instance, or to Slavoj Žižek's parallax, to Freudian double vision, to Mika Baal's ideas about double exposure, to good old postmodern contradiction or paradox, as was proposed a few paragraphs back. My last page. The heirs of Western modernism, which is just as likely to be the problem here as the solution, have nevertheless provided apparently irresistible framing devices. Situationist détournement, I've talked about some of them today, modernist plinth, photographic tableau, performative reenactment, archival reprise. Such art historical tropes have been taken up by these performance artists as metaphors and as modes of translation across cultures and across time. These terms are either massively, if not culturally misleading, or they are allowing performance artists to lead the implicated audience to new understandings, a modern idea if ever there was one. And so, in a bravura artwork, that was his term, Jimmy Durham reframes the world indigenous problem. Indigenous people are not the problem. even though this is how they are perceived, he writes. The real problem is the nation, the way in which the nations of the world are built on ownership of the earth. In one incisive performative gesture, the frame dissolves. Under colonial regimes, much native art has been made for an audience of others. Where history on any grounds has set up borders that distinguish between groups of people, calculation of benefit or the need to protect what the border delimits have been the accompanying strategies. The performances of Eustache and Claxton, of Rees, Belmore and Dick, all of them implicating their mixed audiences, are poised somewhere between border control and ontological predicament.
I want to thank everybody, all three of you, for such great, thought-provoking talks. There's a quote that I come back to again and again from a Chinese artist, Wen Tixian. Some of you heard me talk about it before, but the quote is that reconciliation is something that the artist must imagine. And the reason I come back to that again and again is because it seems like there's so much to be thought through in that short statement. And it's quite often taken up by critics as that art is this glib idea that can solve problems for us. And I think what all three of the speakers did today is to show how much deeper that goes, that how art, if anything, problematizes reconciliation and even explodes it, asks us to think outside of what reconciliation is. So I appreciate all your thoughts to helping me think through that a little more. I'm sure that people have other things that they'd like to ask, so I'd like to open the floor to the audience if they have questions for any of our speakers or all of them.
Okay. Okay, I'm just going to reiterate the question that was given by Marcia Crosby before she left, because she had to leave. She couldn't stay, and so her question sort of hung in the air. The question was, does a curator or artist or a lecturer have the responsibility to address the re-traumatization caused by the work they do on the subject of trauma? Does a curator, artist, or lecturer have the responsibility to address the re-traumatization caused by the work they do on the subject of trauma?
It's so loaded, right? So on one hand, should we not do anything, or should we do something that could trigger something? We could be triggered by looking at a belt, looking at a book. So many things can trigger responses. I think that we're, in this case, a special case, though, something extraordinary. And to even approach this as though it were curation alone would be irresponsible. So figuring out how, acting as a curator, acting as a community member, you're going to negotiate that space and not as an individual person is the only way. And so that's going to be different from community to community. So I remember when Heather Iglesias was concerned with representing images for her community in consultation, it seemed to me that things were pared back so extraordinarily not to trigger anything. And yet, as she said to me too, it still does. So it's such a broad field. I think what you're asking too is, how are we to be responsible? And that's difficult. And we will always make mistakes in something we say or do. And I think being comfortable with error is a beginning place.
I agree with David, but I'd also add something, and that question comes from several different places and communities. It's often used, I think, to keep artists, curators, and lecturers from bringing this work out. And it's more a fear of the state, the mainstream, that doesn't want it out there because they don't want to see it. It's not that, you know, the subjects are. I do think it's true, and that's very true, and that's what I was just going to say. And I'll use my analogy will be like the Holocaust Museum. And I remember, you know, the first time I went to a Holocaust museum, and I lost relatives there. And I mean, it's a profoundly disturbing experience, but a profound experience. And do some people not go? Absolutely, because they can't bring themselves to interact with those objects or with even the didactic around it. And that's we have to honor that in the same way that that Maori people will not go and see a likeness of a person who's dead. That doesn't stop us from showing them, but also making sure that they know when they're in there. And we have to be incredibly conscious of that, but that should also not stop us from moving forward, because this idea of, you know, being re-traumatized is real. However, it will never the idea of bringing the truth has to be first and foremost, I think, and I think the truth is always, for me, takes primacy.
What happens when it comes across as packaging?
You know what? We have to be very careful of it. We are going to make mistakes, as David says, and that's why we have to be constantly able and willing to address when we do make mistakes. But you know, how it comes across is, you know, I mean, there are always going to be people who will have problems with it from any of a number of different ideological viewpoints. And again, you know, I speak to the Holocaust Museum, which are still, you know, I mean, you know, the critique of them comes from very different, you know, a lot of different places, and they're very weird because the perspectives are so totally different. Do we have to acknowledge that critique is there? Absolutely. But should we not put it out there because of that critique? No, because then we would be bending to a certain populism that I think, you know, doesn't move our dialogue forward. It's fine to have a view. And it's also fine not to view something. And I don't want to dominate this, so maybe Cheryl wants to talk.
I just want to add one little bit, though, because Alex Janvier's painting in the exhibition, it was great going back to see that again, is to me an incredible touchstone with this problem. So he articulates in the back of the painting the kinds of people who could not even speak at all as being central. And he isn't speaking for them, but then he speaks on the back and on the front. And you have to go to the back to get that message. It's on the front, but it's almost illegible. You have to go to the back. So you have to become an active participant. He's not telling you what to think. He's giving his testimony. And for me, that goes into this field of not truth and reconciliation, but fact and conciliation. Puts us in a different position. Here is what happened. You deal with it however you want. And as you say, you know, I'm interested in all the strategies. This is something we have to do. So when Mushhole was presented and Jonathan's here, it had to be accompanied, right? So I go to that exhibition, and each one of those works is a trauma of a different sort. Some are completely under control, like Rebecca Belmore's piece, and other ones are out of control. And I feel like I have to be shepherded through, helped through. You know, so there's all kinds of strategies we're going to have to work out in the future. And I look at plain society people and display mechanisms of the tipi liner, for instance. That wasn't an individual, I'm going to make this individual act in my studio, and then it's just out there on the wall. It was part of a collaborative strategy. Elders or warriors would sit around there, and here's what you can present. Well, let's negotiate. And then those things were only, you could look at them and still not get the story, only in oral storytelling and how those stories were passed on to other people could that be revealed. But this is why we make art. It's like this third person where you have to interrogate that work, and if the artist is there, they'll tell you what they feel they can give you at that time. I feel uncomfortable with witnesses, and I'm sorry, the woman's therapy paintings that are out there is just too much for me. She's not there, and those weren't works of art. You know, they weren't public works of art. They should be in a separate setting. I don't like seeing Alex's work accompanied by all kinds of other visual noise. I don't like looking at Adrian's work that should be in its own room, and the text should tell us that those things are from the Old Sun School, and on, right? It's good enough, though. We can only be good enough. And we'll get better through critique. Sorry.
It's okay, I'm getting used to being dominated by you guys. And,
That's not the word I would use.
No.
Question, but my
Maybe we can open up
my
the
note
floor.
was, just one second, my note was that there's an absence of First
Charlotte still hasn't had a chance to respond. I would like to give her the opportunity to add her voice to this.
well, I actually agree with both the guys. But the first, I think the first time I saw one of these troubling, well, troubling is hardly the right word. It was Robert Hoole's Sandy Bay watercolors. He showed them to me. He only didn't want them to be part of a group exhibition. I can see why. I mean, for reasons not unrelated to what you've just said. Robert, when he heard we were thinking of trying to do an exhibition around TRC, he said, TRC, forget it. Charlotte, there are two things to say. Never forget, never forgive. You know.
Jonathan?
I wanted to pick up on what...
You don't need it, man.
Well, there are people behind me, though. I wanted to pick up on what David started with his talk, and this is in no way meant to be taken as a defense of any decisions that we made to show the work by Gary Miller and his still collaborator and curator Neil Keating. And David and I have been speaking about this for 4 years. It's been 4 years since that happened. Because it's essential that the story that David told is told, because that happened. There's a much bigger story too, and I'm part of some of it, but I'm certainly not part of all of it. Neil and Gary are not here again, and so that remains an issue. But just a couple of, I just wanted to throw a couple of things in there. 4 years ago, 3 weeks ago, 4 years and 3 weeks ago, and it's etched in my brain, I was the chair of that panel. Heather Igloliorte was the organizer and a panelist, and of course there was Jeff Thomas as well. And none of us knew that the artist would go missing. None of us knew what his collaborator was going to say beyond the images that we'd been supplied with, which were, it was a straightforward PowerPoint. This is how we put the show together. This is what it looked like in 2008 at the Woodland Cultural Center. And then there were these extra slides that none of us knew about. And it was this cultural necrosis piece, and it was horrible, horrible. I'm really surprised that we actually salvaged the day and moved forward, if it can even say that. But I want to pick up on, and Tanya, you and I have spoken at length about this too, this word responsibility. And the other word that I would use that's really important is this idea of relationship. And I think I'd like you guys to comment on that as curators, as people who have worked very, very closely with artists. After that horrible thing happened, when the artist resurfaced, I had many conversations with him on the phone. I hosted him in my office at the Aboriginal Healing Foundation to sort of bring together the ACC organizers and the artist to just talk out what happened. And that led to what's been a 4-year conversation with Gary off and on, mostly good, sometimes not very good, but also conversations with Neil, mostly bad, that worked through to the point of agree to disagree, and then worked through to the point of, okay, the work still needs to be shown, so how do we work through these things? And you'll recall when he came to the ACC meeting, it was with this package and a letter that was imploring people to help us get this work shown, because the Canadian state refuses to show it. Whether or not that's accurate, that was the message, right? And then this thing happened, and the artist felt like he was thrown under the bus. So I entered into a relationship. I was told that the relationship between the artist and the collaborator-curator was there to stay, and that if I felt a sense of responsibility to Gary, the artist, that was how we'd have to work with it. And so it was 4 years of conversation to decide that we would ultimately show selected works. And we didn't agree on the selected works. Neil and I did not agree. I got my way, I'd like to say, but and it worked really, really well. But the power of what we were able to do was the fact that I don't run a gallery. I run the Shingwalk Residential School Center, which is governed by survivors and the university. And so I took this entire story, the one that David told, plus all the pieces that I'm able to add to it, I took it to the survivors and said, what should we do? And the survivors said, we want to show this work. We want to show the really horrible stuff, because that's what we do as this center. We take on even the most difficult things. But we also want to show, you know, some of these other pieces that, frankly, Neil didn't want to show. He wanted to make it the genocide show. And that's not what we wanted to do. So I drove down to Bancroft, Ontario to meet with Gary and Neil face-to-face, and that was an essential piece that we had to talk these things through. And it took a really long time, and I wasn't sure that we were going to do it. And then there was agreement, and it was based on the survivors taking the lead and advising us. Much of what I said to the survivors was advice that I had sought and then got from people like David, people like Tanya, people like Steve. Some people said, don't do it. Some people said, if you do it, consider these things. Some people said, like the survivors I work with, one of them said, we must show it, we will not censor it, we will not mediate it, we won't do anything. That's one of the survivors. In the end, as you guys know, we showed it 2 hours a day, only when staff was present, only when a survivor and or an elder and or a cultural support or emotional support person was available. And so those are the efforts that we took. But I was really concerned about this issue of responsibility, and I put a question mark behind it. I remember talking to David at length. If I feel like I have a responsibility to this artist, what the hell do I do? And it's because of this relationship. So, boy, that was really long. So, from responsibility then to relationship. Thank you for indulging me.
I think we, how about Ryan, did you want to add?
Since we're unraveling the situation that happened a couple of years ago, I just want to let you know that I was the one who invited Gary Miller to come and be on the panel. For several reasons, Gary was doing this exhibition and we were doing this panel on the residential school and exhibitions that were tied to this. But the question I have is, why did Gary Miller seek out Neil Keating? Why didn't he go to any other Native curator? And this is a question that I know a little bit more about, and we can talk about it another time. But that's the question, is why did Gary Miller choose an anthropologist in upstate New York to curate this exhibition? And where did that responsibility come from? Is it Gary Miller's responsibility because he selected this person? Neil Keating didn't do the exhibition on his own. Gary sought him out.
Well, and maybe we're running into coffee break time, and we need to make sure we're ready for the next panel as well. So if some quick responses from everyone, and then we'll.
I think the book, this is what anthropologists should be doing, right? They should be writing the book of these, do we call them collaborations between Indigenous artists and these gatekeepers, so they are curators of a sort, whether it was more so or all through the history. Are they collaborators? Are they enablers? Are they constructors of this work? This is work that's actually been done by being done by anthropologists in Australia right now, looking at these weird instances of overlap. And why is it that both groups need each other? But the difficulty of going to your own, in that sense, why is that gap? I think that's a profound gap. It's certainly changing, This artist, as I feel, has been outside of all kinds of loops. So there hasn't been a community member of the sort. So that might have something to do with it, and I think that's changing. I think, too, that the nature of Aboriginal curation is changing. You know, it's becoming much broader. The idea, that exhibition, that is a very important work, but it is a spectacle, and you had to step in as a curator to make it right. You know, what Keating did, you had to work around him to make this thing work right and make it truly, this is a case of that Aboriginal sovereign display territory. That's what you made happen. I think it was very important. You saved the day.
And I would add just very briefly to that, I think, you know, we've got to be careful that we don't, because that whole incident, I think, is symptomatic. And we can't, you know, like, yeah, those are really profound questions, but I absolutely agree with David, as the ground shifts, you know, that will happen less. But I think that's absolutely symptomatic of the relationship and the view of Aboriginal art and this being outside and being othered for so long. And you know, I mean, we can speak about that whole history and the history of events that give rise to that. And I think that's, you know, we've got to get to the heart of the problem.
Yes.
Anybody ever see Color Purple? Yes. That's about sexual abuse. Now that's pretty raw. Oprah herself had experienced that, and women all over the world look at that, and it's part of their healing. So I don't know exactly how that relates to what you're saying, but the rawness. So people, survival. I've been involved with survivors. Okay, they need the raw stuff out there. They need it out there. No keeping it all inside. Okay, do with what you will.
I think it's important that it all exists, all these artworks being made. But it is the curator's responsibility to mediate it in some way, and being attentive to the audience who will come in and prepare them for what could be a triggering moment of disaster. And so this idea of care is really important. I am working on a residential school show that might not be one. What I've decided to do, working with my collaborator, Michelle LaValle in Regina, is we're going to curate people instead of objects. And they're going to tell us what's going to be in there or not be in there. But central will be their orality. They're going to be there, or they're going to be working with docents who will be entrusted with their stories, and you can only look at that work with that storyteller. So you can't be there as a passive observer. You have to be there engaged in a relationship. That's just one possible thing I've learned from looking at Indigenous ways of making art in the past. But working with this guy named Roger Ross, who I've worked with other projects before, and he's Cree and Métis, and he was talking, he said, you know, you've been doing these interviews with survivors, and I've been going through these discs, listening to these stories, and I didn't quite get the pattern, but he says, you know, all of them, whenever they talk about the residential school experience, they all speak in the third person, you know, this need to distance. And then we were talking about it further, and we were thinking that the objects, the works of art, these are third people. These are the third person. So instead of me talking to you about something that happened to me or you happened to you, we can go and talk with that third person who takes all that pain and communicates and so on. But it's only available to us depending on our level of engagement with it. And then having a mediator, in this case that I'm talking about, will happen. But I like this idea of, when I look at Alex's work in there, and Adrian's even more so, they're not works of art anymore. They're not even works of culture. They're sacred objects, and they deserve a different kind of treatment. And we have to treat them as third people. Anyway, that's what I want to say.
Thank you. All right, so there were a lot of things that one could say, but maybe just to take up David saying that he felt that, I forget exactly what you said, but Gina Lang's work in the exhibition, which might or might not have been there. The reason it is...
I'm glad it was there, but it's just so painful.
Yeah, it is. It's, yeah, words fail, but it's there because the Belkin Gallery has a relationship with Ron Hamilton, Kikein. We did an exhibition of his of New Charles Tlitzabiltin, the ceremonial curtains, and that exhibition, I think, gained for the Belkin Gallery, the art gallery in the university, the trust of the owners of the Tlitzabiltin. They agreed to have them in there. And I think, Scott, you there? You know, on the basis of that, there was a reasonable relationship, and so the Belkin's now publishing a book about the Tlitzabiltin, and there are an extraordinary number of complicated family relationships involved in getting those pieces. Each one belongs to a particular family, getting their permission to have them in the art gallery. And however weird that transition is, or problematic, or whatever, it happened. And all those New Charlotte people wanted it to happen. As a result of that, when Scott thought of the idea of doing an exhibition to coincide with the TRC, however problematic that is, I asked Ron, you know, is there some, because I know he's been very much involved in bringing this history forward, is that, what do you know, what can you tell us about? Because I thought he might know something that wasn't, you know, within the normal purview of art. And so he remembered Gina Lang's works, which he had seen her bring out in a, I don't know, therapeutic context, in a closed New Charlotte gathering, right? He'd seen them, he'd remembered them. Oh my God, how could you not remember them once you'd seen them? And he said, you should try and ask her, even though she lives hard to reach, far away, she might not want this at all. But actually, she was glad to be asked, and she was glad to have them there, and she's been in the gallery quite a bit, and I took my class there, and she takes your hand and says, I want to tell you what this means, and what this one means. Typically, you know, everybody's, it's I don't know why I'm telling you this. Is that help? Is that, you know, is this what art galleries should or shouldn't be doing? What do we think of TRC? I don't know, but there was some very, very human moments there, and that exhibition's been very well attended. So, you know, things speak for themselves, perhaps.
We're going to start our final session. Good afternoon. First, I would like to acknowledge and express my gratitude for being able to live and work in this beautiful place, the unceded ancestral and traditional territory of the Musqueam and Coast Salish peoples. My name is Dory Nason. I'm an assistant professor here in the First Nations Studies program in the Department of English. It is an honor and a privilege to moderate today's panel titled Modernity and Indigeneity. Our esteemed speakers, both whose work has been a great inspiration to me and I'm certain many, many other Indigenous women. First, I am happy to introduce a mentor and my friend, Dr. Sherry Hundorf. Sherry's work has been integral to my own and the many students in my Indigenous Feminisms course, many who are here today. Sherry Hundorf is currently Professor of Native American Studies and Comparative Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. She's the author of 2 books, Going Native, Indians and the American Cultural Imagination, and Mapping the Americas, The Transnational Politics of Contemporary Native Culture. She's the co-editor of a UBC volume, Indigenous Women and Feminism, Politics, Activism, Culture, a staple in all of our First Nation Studies courses. Currently, she is working on a manuscript tentatively titled Indigeneity and the Politics of Space, Gender, Geography, and Culture. Dr. Hundorf's paper is titled Vision, Truth, Memory, Art of the Residential School Experience. Our second presenter is a colleague and a former neighbor of mine, whose work I admire greatly, Dana Claxton. Professor Claxton is a member of the Lakota Nation. She is a curator, artist, and assistant professor in UBC's Department of Art History, Visual Art and Theory. Her work has been shown internationally at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Sundance Film Festival, Isleworth Museum, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, Australia. Our She has received numerous awards, including the Jack and Doris Shaput Foundation Viva Award for the Visual Arts and Abstract Fellowship. Professor Claxton's paper is titled "The Sublime is Always Rewilding the Primitive." Please help me welcome our two presenters.
Thank you, Dory, for the introduction. I also want to start by thanking Shelley Rosenblum and the organizers of the symposium for the invitation to be here. I'm really delighted to be here. These have been very fascinating and enlightening conversations, and it's a privilege to be part of them. And I also want to acknowledge the Musqueam people whose territory this is. This invitation was impossible for me to turn down for a number of reasons. And one is that the place where I'm from, which is Alaska, has a history that is in some ways more similar to that of Canada than it is to the rest of the United States. When we think about the boarding school policy in the United States, one thing that we say about it is that in relation to Canada is that our policy ended much earlier. And so those memories are much less immediate. Most of the schools in the United States closed by the early 1930s. And that's true of every place in the United States except for Alaska, where boarding schools were the de facto policy until the late 1970s. So that my father, his siblings, and everyone in his generation, most everyone in his generation, attended mission schools, and most of them attended boarding schools. So I knew this growing up, but I knew very little about the schools themselves because nobody talked about them. And it remained true that I knew very little until, 10 years ago or so, when the violence of the schools in Alaska came to light and the collusion of the Catholic Church in particular, and that violence became sort of front page news. About that time, there was a documentary that came out in the United States that was about boarding schools and sexual violence in Alaska. And that documentary told the story of a place called St. Michael's, which is the place where my grandmother was from, although she didn't grow up there. And the story that was told was of collusion between the priests and the teachers in the schools that resulted in every child in that village being sexually abused over a course of many years. And the title of that documentary was called, symptomatically, was called The Silence. So learning that history in that way made me think about silence and how we can understand silence, and also how we can represent it. So when I was asked to participate in this symposium, the question that I wanted to think about was, what can art tell us about the residential school experience that testimonials cannot? And I approached that question with that issue of silence and what silence means at the background of my thinking. And now I'm going to show, unfortunately, my technological incompetence. I'm going to start with the same image that David started with. Okay. Down at the bottom, enter full screen. Thank you, Tara. Okay. A single image called Rape, taken from a current exhibition of the work of Mohawk artist R.G. Miller, calls up questions about the role of visual art in uncovering truths about the residential school experience. The image depicts a very young child, his face the picture of unspeakable anguish, and his mouth twisted in a cry that can never be heard. It appears in a series of images that, taken together, represent the 11 years that Miller spent at the Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School in Ontario. The exhibition emerges, Miller explains, from, and this is a quote, a combination of vague, mundane memories of years at the school and flashes of horror experienced there. They are the strongest memories I could approach without descending into a place I would not be able to emerge from. That's the end of the quote. Creating the images, he continues, was as close as I could come with sharing my story. Miller's art renders, in other words, trauma that cannot be expressed in words or ordered in narrative, but that surfaces instead in inchoate expressions of pain that then reach out to viewers with their raw immediacy, drawing us into their unfathomable depths. As the image depicts pain that defies verbal expression, rape also represents the indigenous body as the site of inexplicable and unacknowledged brutality. As suffering distorts the child's face, his body fades into a black background so that the rape and its perpetrator remain unseen, a somber invocation of the silence that surrounds such acts of violence. At the same time, the body fading into black calls up the threat of engulfment by darkness, in his words, of descending into a place from which it would be impossible to emerge, and perhaps also a perilous longing to escape from the torments of the material world. In these ways, Miller's work constitutes, in a phrase from the exhibition's title, a form of visual testimony that points to the limits of the word in representing the residential school experience, and it thus raises questions about the connections between art, truth, and historical memory that are at the center of the exhibition we are here to discuss today. Staging the exhibition witnesses in conjunction with the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission raises crucial questions about what art can contribute to our understanding of the residential experience that testimonials cannot. Testimonials bring to light those experiences that can be remembered and spoken, that can be ordered in narrative, thus filling the gaps and erasures of a colonial history that leaves its own terrible violence unspoken and unnamed. Yet, as Miller's work illustrates, the histories of residential schools demand attention to silence, to unspeakable traumas, and to the stories that bodies can tell that narratives perhaps cannot. Therein lie the possibilities of art. What unique understandings and political meanings emerge from rendering the residential school experience, visually and spatially, and from using the body rather than the word as a tool for political expression? And how is it possible in the process to portray silence and absence, the grievous consequences of residential schools that resist representation? As residential school art captures experiences that resist verbal expression, it also recalls the historical role of the image in violence against Aboriginal peoples. Contemporary Aboriginal art, of course, is not the first body of work to thematize the residential school experience visually. While the works in the Witnesses exhibition draw their meanings in part from their connection to testimonials, so too do they take shape in relation to what Alan Sekula calls the shadow archive, the historical repertoire of images that defines and classifies social groups and situates them politically. For Aboriginal peoples, these encompass residential school photographs, the before and after images that circulated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to promote assimilation policies. Such images drew upon racial typologies to define Aboriginal bodies as savage, inferior, and thus in need of reform. And they also consigned Indigenous peoples to a historical past destined to disappear in the wake of civilization. Before and after photographs characterize the transformation of Aboriginal children in the schools as benevolent progress, thereby obscuring the violence of assimilation and the brutality enacted on children in the schools. Beyond the content of these images, the form of the photograph itself contributed to the colonizing culture's sense of ownership and control. Early racial images, writes cultural critic Coco Fusco, and this is a quote, objectified and miniaturized their reference and symbolically linked the acquisition of racial knowledge with the possession of other people as things, end quote. These images thus offered, in her words, a vicarious experience of power and the fantasy of omnipotence. In Indigenous contexts, this ties photography to material practices of dispossession, the theft of territories and cultural objects, a history that positions the museum itself as a site of colonial power. Nor were photographs the only popular representations of residential schools. Late 19th and early 20th century U.S. World's Fairs famously featured faux boarding schools. There, Native children were placed on display to exemplify the virtues of assimilation and to recast colonization as benevolence to global audiences. Contemporary Aboriginal art of the residential school experience, in my reading, is at once at odds with and inseparable from this history of colonial representations. These works engage in a strategy that critic Karina Aileris, writing about representations of Algerian women, labels disidentification. Disidentification, as she defines it, is not, and this is a quote, is not reducible to a desire to reject representation. Instead, it is a strategy that works on and against dominant ideology, one that involves at least partial incorporation of and negotiation with dominant fictions, end quote. As contemporary Aboriginal artists provide visual testimony about the residential school experience, they disrupt the politics of colonial display by transforming the meanings of Indigenous bodies to expose rather than obscure violence. By resignifying a figure laden by a colonial visual economy, these works open the possibility of new iconographies of Indigenous bodies that position Native peoples as the subjects, not just the objects of knowledge, and thus create new understandings of their political roles. Representational authority connects to political authority, so it is not accidental that the Aboriginal political movements that compelled the formation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission coincide with the groundswell in the production of art on the residential schools. To make these arguments, I analyzed two works in the Witnesses exhibit, Rebecca Belmore's video installation Apparition and Joanne Cardinal Schubert's performance installation The Lesson, and I attend not only to what they tell us about residential schools, but also to how they reflect on and unsettle historical images of Indigenous people. And I'll turn now to Apparition. Indigenous bodies, the histories and meanings that they bear, their significance as an enduring site of ongoing colonial violence and Native resistance, are at the center of Rebecca Belmore's art. Indeed, the body, as she explains in a recent interview, provides her most crucial tool for political expression. This is a quote. "I am very much aware of myself as a politicized body. With my body, I can address history, I can address the immediate, I can address political issues. For me, performance is deeply personal because it's my way of speaking out," end quote. Tensions between speaking and silence and the histories borne by the body animate Apparition, and the work calls up the violence enacted on Aboriginal bodies in residential schools as it construes silencing itself as a form of violence. Apparition, in Belmore's words, reflects my understanding of the loss of our language, of the devastating effects of the residential school system, particularly the deliberate role it played in the silencing of our language. For this reason, Apparition is an image of myself, a silent portrait of this loss. Her body, in other words, provides a vehicle for making silence legible, for marking a particular kind of loss that can only be rendered through the absence of words. By taking the Aboriginal body as its subject and using it to represent cultural loss, Apparition recalls historical images of residential schools, the before and after sequences of photographs that also depicted cultural loss in visual form. But while these images lauded cultural loss as a transition to civilization, Apparition subverts this colonial meaning, in part by depicting the Indigenous body through performance rather than still image. Performance, argues Ellen Diamond, shifts attention from, these are her words, authority to effect, from text to body, to the spectator's freedom to make and transform meanings. Indeed, Apparition transforms the meaning of the Indigenous body so that it exposes rather than obscures the violence of the residential school experience, as it also undermines the temporal understandings that rationalized assimilation policies. Apparition counters colonial meanings of residential school images in part by recalling and inverting the transformations they represent. Conventional images cast residential school education as social uplift, in part through changes in bodily stance. Before photographs frequently feature children sitting on the ground, while after photographs show them sitting on chairs or standing. And this change accompanies other signifiers of civilization, European clothing and activities. And I just have one example of a before and after sequence that does exactly that. This is taken from the Hampton Institute in Virginia, and here's the before sequence of 3 girls arriving. And the after image is 14 months later. And you can see that the transformation is signified in all kinds of ways: clothes, occupation. Domestic signifiers are very important, but what I'm interested in here is that move from sitting on the ground to standing up, and that's really typical of before and after photographs. In the opening of Apparition, let's go back to that, Belmore's own bodily stance mimics these changes but assigns them different meanings. She first appears with face to the floor and then raises to face the viewer, exposing the duct tape that seals her mouth shut. The image recalls an entire iconography of racial violence. In the U.S. context from which I write, this extends most infamously from 19th century lynching photographs to contemporary images of prison abuse at Abu Ghraib. These visual resonances locate residential schools in a long history of racial violence, while that also encompasses the silencing of indigenous languages. Yet, although the indigenous body appears as a site of violence, the video installation further underscores the contrast with residential school photographs, because here the indigenous body is neither docile nor quiescent. Confronting viewers with her gaze, Belmore removes the tape from her mouth in a gesture of refusal that suggests not only refusal but also hopefulness, a possibility of autonomy and cultural recovery. Yet, like much of Belmore's work, Apparition is fraught with contradiction and ambiguity. Its title registers at once absence and presence, loss and ghostly persistence, and the artwork itself protests the violence of residential schools while it also bespeaks their abiding effects. Even after Belmore removes the duct tape, she remains silent, marking the enduring losses caused by residential schools. Such tensions between survival and loss also bear on her physical body. On one hand, the very appearance of a contemporary Aboriginal body contests the temporal logic of residential school images that confined Indigenous peoples to the historical past and forecast their disappearance in the wake of modernity. This logic inhered not only in the content of the images, but in their photographic form, which fixed its subjects in time. Performance, by contrast, denotes contemporaneity and thus survival. Nevertheless, at the end of the video installation, Belmore's image fades into ghostly absence, a reminder perhaps of the irreversible losses caused by the schools, of the children who never returned home and whose stories can never be told. Through these contradictions, Apparition renders the complex realities that are the legacies of the residential schools, realities of survival and persistence, but also of losses that must be remembered and mourned. And I'll turn now to the lesson. Like Belmore's Apparition, Joanne Cardinal Schubert's The Lesson offers a critique of the residential school experience, in part through its rendering of Aboriginal bodies and their absence. Created in 1989 as an interactive performance installation, The Lesson takes the shape of a residential school classroom. Its two walls resemble chalkboards inscribed with the teacher's lessons, and students' desks fill the floor space. While Apparition calls up historical photographs of residential schools, The Lesson brings to bear another representational tradition, that of the late 19th and early 20th century World's Fairs exhibits that defined Indigenous peoples and their social places for global audiences. In the United States, global exhibitions of the period featured boarding school classrooms where actual instruction took place. There, Indigenous children selected from actual boarding schools and brought to the fairs for purposes of display became living exhibits to promote policies of assimilation. In the faux classrooms, they served as counterpoints to another Indigenous body, that of the so-called blanket Indian, stationed in the corner of the room, a contrast that rendered visible their progress on the path to assimilation. Beyond promoting the schools, World's Fairs exhibits manifested another kind of colonial power as well. By making Aboriginal children a spectacle, silencing them and subjecting them to a gaze that could not be returned, the exhibits depicted them as socially inferior and requiring colonial control. At the same time, through the content and dynamics of display, white viewers in the aftermath of the Indian Wars found assurance that native populations had been safely contained. In these ways, the displays at once masked and contributed to colonial violence within and beyond the schools. Contrasting The Lesson with these displays brings to light the politics at the center of the installation. Cardinal Schubert created the installation because, in her words, the residential period needed to be exposed in such a manner as to indicate the genocide construct. That was a quote. Spatiality is one technique that exposes this genocide construct, in part because space exposes material enactments of power on bodies that frequently fall outside of discourse in official histories. In the lesson, these include confinement that finds expression in the chairs hitched tightly to one another, preventing movement, and the rope on the stool at the back of the classroom, the place of punishment. At the same time, attention to space opens possibilities for multiple alternative histories that challenge dominant discourses, and this also holds true in the lesson. The installation is also a performance space, and in earlier stagings, former students of the residential schools occupied the chairs and testified to their experiences. This classroom holds no room for a teacher, so that the performance installation inverts colonial structures of authority to make the children the sources of the lesson. As their stories testify to the obscured violence of the schools, the performance disrupts temporal understandings that rationalize assimilation by demanding attention to the survival and persistence of Aboriginal peoples. Yet like Belmore's apparition, the lesson also attests to their absence. When it is not a performance space, the classroom is empty, with children strikingly absent. The lesson thus serves at once as a space for testifying to the violence of the schools and for memorializing the stories and bodies lost to that violence. The spatiality of the installation creates another crucial effect that is vital to its political meaning. Entering the installation, viewers must negotiate their own relationship to the space and the histories embedded within it as they themselves become part of the display. Not only does the lesson thus disrupt the dynamics of colonial power by making visitors the objects rather than the unseen subjects of the gaze, but also by making them part of the exhibition, it raises questions about their role in the ongoing politics of colonization. By positioning non-Indigenous peoples within the classroom space itself, the lesson creates the possibility for a sense of relatedness and empathy as well. Cardinal Schubert explains, this is a quote, "That classroom for me has been kind of therapeutic. I was so sick of the rhetoric that was going on. Everybody was talking about the effects, the assault on Native children through the educational system, but I don't think non-Natives had a sense of what people actually went through. The physical state of that classroom with its rigid little seating and tying the chairs together was my attempt at trying to show just how restrictive it really was and how we were and still are looked at as if we're all the same," end quote. The lesson, in short, aims to transform us by creating a greater understanding of and connection to the children who endured residential school education. At the same time, along with other art of the residential school experience, it demands accountability for the violence that occurred there, accountability that must encompass not only an acknowledgement of history, but also of its enduring effects and our own responsibility for bringing about social justice. Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And I'd also like to thank the Balkan Gallery and the organizers of this event and everybody's words today. And I acknowledge that I am also on the unceded territory of the Musqueam people. The name of my talk represents three main ideas that I'm currently investigating. One, the sublime. I'm completely enchanted with the sublime and how it might operate within a Lakota Sioux cosmology. Two, I'm interested in the question of how to keep Indigenous art wild within frameworks of modernity, as well as I'm interested in how we might indigenize the word primitive. Oddly, when I ponder modernity and art, I think about abstract expressionism and Barnett Newman's essay titled "The Sublime is Now." I have to confess, I feel quite frivolous because I have this huge crush right now on Barnett Newman. So the essay that he wrote, "The Sublime is Now," in 1948. So in this essay, he questions earlier ideas of the sublime, going all the way back to Longinus's analysis of this exaltation that happens, some type of out-of-body experience, which also speaks to me. And that it was achieved through some sort of an objective rhetoric. So it was through, what was written, and the slave was reading it to him, and he could hear it, so he would have this moment. So to Barnett, this very confused idea was continued with Kant's reading of the sublime as this transcendent perception, and then on to Hegel's theory of beauty within formal hierarchies. if I'm understanding Barnett properly, his concern was that beauty was deemed to be found only in the perfect object, unlike, say, the Baroque, which was about destroying form, and he was interested in where the form can be formless. So he was deeply invested in creating an American art that didn't have to subscribe to anything European or these old notions of beauty. He declared that the importance, if not the need, for an American sublime within art and a return to, quote, man's natural desire for the exalted. Newman observed in an essay, the ideographed picture essay, that named an unnamed Kwakiwak artist, but they used the word Kwakiwak. He explained the Kwakiwak artist's artistic process, and that it consisted of, quote, the abstract shape he used. His entire plastic language was directed by a ritual towards metaphysical understanding. And then goes on to say, to him, a shape was a living thing, a vehicle of an abstract thought, a carrier of awesome feelings he felt before the unknowable, end of quote. So Newman was suggesting that he thought of what he thought was an indigenous sublime, and that abstract shapes shaped abstract thoughts, and that abstract thoughts shaped abstract shapes. The abstraction is inherent within indigenous worldviews, I would claim. This is why I'm interested and have this current crush on Newman's suggestion of the sublime as now. And I think that he knew in some ways that in order for an American sublime to exist, within the realization of the abstract, which he found, borrowed, perhaps even admired, he found that in American Indian thinking and other forms of, primitive ideas and iconographies, and that way of sort of being in the world. So for me, the sublime is always, and not now, the sublime isn't dead, but the sublime is always, and it's this ongoing kind of entity, if you will, and I relate it to the realm of spirit. So I don't want to unpack Newman's and the New York School's extensive interest in Native American thought, and culture making, but do want to say that Jackson Rushing's essay, Ritual and Myth, Native American Culture and Abstract Expressionism, is such a well-researched document, and it states that, quote, in their research for holistic experience, these painters helped resolve the crisis of subject matter common to American artists in the 1940s by establishing themes of universal relevance based on Native American traditions, images, and processes, end of quote. And then he further states that American Native art and culture could be a wellspring for a modern art that portrayed the collective experience, end of quote. So the idea, for me, maybe for you, so the idea that Newman's modernist, sophisticated, abstract expressionism was deeply inspired by the so-called primitive informs my inquiry into what was not deeply inspired from our cultures, such as equal distribution of wealth and collective ways of living. Why didn't, so I'll get into that a little bit later on. So in addition, although I won't discuss fully today, but certainly contact with the Americas, the New World, had an enormous effect and influence on old world intellectual thought and ideas of autonomy. So Newman, and then of course hippies later, and New Age, neo-tribalism, and the current sort of Navajo and tribal geometrics plastered over everything from underwear to luxury towels, continue to borrow from American Indian spiritual thought and iconographies. It's it's a cycle. It seems to happen every, I don't know, maybe 25 years or 30 years or something. So in discussing terms like modernity and indigeneity, I must first address what these words mean to me or my understanding of them. Modernity, a time of history that was about leaving the past behind and moving forward with technology. Elements of colonial modernity included universal certainties, human reason, and using technology to overcome nature, and perhaps the primitive within nature, within her. The modern is often seen as the opposite to the primitive. But But Newman and others thought that modern man should be wild, so to speak. Indigeneity is a relatively new term within the academy, for me anyhow. I think I just, I don't know, last 5 or 6 years or something, that the academy is using, and one that generally recognizes through analysis that indigenous knowledges and histories are legitimate and must be included within most discourses ranging from art to science. Indigeneity is not exclusive to Aboriginal scholars, and in some ways is the opposite of the modernist not-saids regarding First Nations content within the production of knowledge. The desire to place the primitive within modernist frameworks of art history and social histories as a way of recognition, and to state that, of course, Indian people, also known in some ways as the primitive, was modern, is modern, and were making modern art. So the assertion of Native American modernism into art history, for me, is both scary as well as encouraging. A Soto scholar and artist, Robert Hoole, has stated that, quote, the Christian Eurocentric notion of modernity is an ideology. There was no room or any notion or acceptance that we would have any notion of art making, let alone on abstraction in all of our visual languages, end of quote. So the we and the our in this statement are referring to Aboriginal people, and that our art making during modernity proper was not seen or accepted into the fold of modern art. But yet Newman recognized our abstraction, and there were a few exhibitions that showed Indigenous works, but the gaps were coupled with formations of oppression, and which created a blockage of fully Native modernist engagement during the height of modernism. In 1985, Hal Foster wrote that, quote, primitivism was instrumental to modernist formations in maintaining identity as superior, end of quote. So this racialized superiority has haunted social policy and relations for several decades now, and continues. In addition, this duality of adore or abhor of the Indian, the primitive, has influenced research, social relations, and established formations that still place Indigenous people in inferior positions. It's the most complicated relationship of fear and love and hate and guilt and respect and disrespect. It's quite the phenomenon, really. So as Hoole suggested, the primitive could never be categorized as a modernist. How would North American modern man be able to exist without the primitive to borrow from or exploit or position oneself against? As in, I am not primitive, I am modern man, I have technology, I have reason, I'm a civilized man, I'm a civilized woman. Lakota scholar Vine Deloria has stated, underneath, quote, underneath all the conflicted images of the Indian, one fundamental truth emerges. The white man knows he is alien, and he knows that North America is Indian, end of quote. I always think that's so dramatic when he says that. And a Hopi scholar and filmmaker supports this, Victor Maseva, with a similar idea, and he suggests the soul of America is Indian. So, and the Americas, of course, including Canada. In his book, New York Stole the Idea of Modern Art, Abstract Expressionism, Freedom, and the Cold War, Serge Guilbeault questions the catalog, or quotes from the catalog of the 1946 exhibition of Northwest Coast art that was in New York, with the essay by Barnett Newman's, and Newman's analysis of the abstract as a Native American concept. So in it, Barnett declares, quote, there is an answer in these works to all of those who assume that modern abstract art is the esoteric exercise of a snobbish elite. For among these simple peoples, abstract art was the normal, well understood dominant tradition. Shall we say that modern man has lost his ability to think on such a high level? Now, what a contradiction is going on in that? So, end of quote. So on one hand, Newman is saying that the primitive is simple, but he thinks on a high level, and that modern man, if incapable of understanding the abstract, has surely lost his ability to think on such a high level. It appears that Newman is suggesting that modern man was once a simple peoples, that who could have thought on a high level, but because of modernity, he has somehow lost his ability to think abstractly or on a high level. So Serge goes on to state that, and this is Serge, quote, "Thus the avant-garde artist took both a prestigious past and an image of gravity and seriousness, as well as a coherent native tradition." So again, confirming that this native tradition had enhanced and influenced, perhaps created abstract expressionism, which were all required for this new time of forging an American image for itself in terms of the production of art. And one which was based on, my argument is, Native American abstract concepts, which could be distinctly American, and further supported the idea that the soul of America is Indian. So the dialectic between uncivilized native and civilized modern man or woman continues to haunt social relations between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples. The divisions run deep, and the visible structural dehumanization of indigenous people continues to harm our communities and perhaps harms non-indigenous communities as well. And so, I think part of this can be attributed, and we've heard it today many times, about, it can be attributed to research and imperialist ethnography, as well as the anthropological gaze, gaps within art historical texts, and perhaps in some cases an erasure of contemporary indigenous aesthetic production in the study of Canadian art and in the study of American art in general, or contemporary art. Of course, we just have to think about where is contemporary indigenous art placed within the United States. In Canada, we know it's a different story, but indigenous contemporary art hardly exists within frameworks of exhibition, art text, or collection in the United States. So in Ian McLean's essay, I just need to have a little drink of water. Am I talking too fast? Am I going over my time? No. Contemporaneous traditions, the world in indigenous art in the world. He explains that modernism was, quote, an aesthetic expression of imperialist colonialism, end of quote, and that formalism repressed the indigenous voice. And although during the height of North American modernism, indigenous cultural practices waned, but images were still alive through iconography, national identity building, and strangely visible through fetish commodity. Indigenous bodies were visible in, of course, pageantry, which you've heard about today, in coins and stamps and diplomatic gifts. So the reservation system in both countries has greatly distanced Indian and non-Indian communities. And through this cultural distancing, there is a loss of potential friendship. And on the, certainly micro level, there are substantial liaisons. But still, as we know with the exhibition of witnesses and through teaching, that Aboriginal content is greatly needed to fill the gaps of the unsaids. So modernity now encompasses these multi-modernities that allow for contesting meta-narratives. My concern for the modernist Indian is that one would have to shed their primitive credentials. To become a modernist Indian, one would have to subscribe to the modernist anxieties of alienation, lack of spirit, and what Philip Shaw calls bourgeois, so my mind's slipping me at the moment right here, individuation. So I'm like, do I want to be a modernist Indian if that's all these things I have to subscribe to? So the wild becomes the regulated, when the primitive enters the place of confinement through modernist interpretations. The title of the symposium suggesting that indeed indigenous communities function in the margins. And then I questions if I do. About 15 years ago, I came out of the margins and now function from the center, of course, of the Sundance Circle. My refusal to be in the margins, however, is radically open, just thinking of bell hooks. And it's safe for me and has forced me to, I'm not sure what it's forced me to do. So I just put forced me to, and I just put ... because I just couldn't finish the thought. So terms like native modernism are useful when attempting to locate an indigenous modernity in the production of art, however fraught with the legacy of colonial, modernism. Native modernism allows for the investigation of a North American indigenous practice within the modernist time frame proper, and by doing so places cultural production within the discourse of North American modernism, hopefully as an equal, not as a fetish or a mere inspiration for abstract expressionisms. And of course the work of George Morrison and Alex Janvier substantiates the contribution to native modernism. So is it all about the prefix? And I was thinking, I think the prefix might be, inclusive, I don't know. But so now we have native modernism, Sioux Sublime, which I'm trying to figure out what that might be. So the Sioux Sublime. So I wanted to look at some work of Sioux artist Oscar Howe, born in 1915, passed in 1983, an attempt to place his modernist aesthetic within a framework of the Sioux Sublime and address how he keeps his modern art wild. Oops, what's going on here? Howe exhibited, and I maybe will list everything but he's, he was practicing for 40 years, exhibited in a lot of places, awarded with a lot of things, and he had a 40-year teaching career at the University of South Dakota. And that's a picture of Oscar Howe. He's my hero. So in this work, Bear Dance, Oscar Howe has painted what he usually painted, which was Sioux ceremonial life. I was thinking he's always painting us dancing, And he was included in a 1941 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art titled Indian Art of the United States. And on the first floor, there was a section titled Indian Art for Modern Living, where his paintings were included. In this work, Bear Dance, Howe is depicting a spiritual dance. The dancer's body is in motion. His dance and his body are abstracted with hints of the real. We see the head of the bear robe in downward motion and the long hair of the dancer dangle in midair. The dancer holds dance sticks and wears moccasins, and there are 3 eagle feathers which are visible. The claws of the bear are intact, and the dancer seems to be in an altered state. Howe uses what he called the straight line technique, which is the straight line of truth, thinking about the conversation of truth earlier, so which was derived from quill work and beadwork as well as ledger drawings, and the straight line represents an unrelented truth. In Sioux beadwork and design, only straight and horizontal vertical lines are used, and so Howe started using a diagonal, using the straight line, but diagonally. Howe, Oscar, has stated, quote, artists reflect and define themselves in the emotional and spiritual aspects of life, end of quote. He was also noted to say that he makes art because he can make art, and it's a duty his duty to the community is to show his people and to render the Sioux within art and within the visual. He called his style of paintings the painting of truth, and we know that's a big word, and by connecting aesthetic points to make visual forms. Many of his paintings depicted traditional ceremonies within themselves or sublime. Howe explains his lines as the triangular patterns that denote the 3-point design of a Sioux symbol for the earth, the sky, and the 4 cardinal points. With all of his work, there is a connection to the earth and the sky, and he states that, quote, close to harmony with nature is emphasized by formal abstraction, end quote. So Ghost Dance here, I love this work. So not all of Howe's work fell within Western notions of modernity, and sometimes I think he gets left out of those conversations because he also had somewhat of a commercial practice. But I also think that if we only subscribe to sort of Western modernist definitions of art, then we fail to realize or recognize further indigenous aesthetic qualities that are inherent in the works. Oscar Howe was considered really one of the first Native American modernist artists, and he was an advocate for American Indian modernity. And there's the well-known challenge of the Philbrook Museum in 1958 when he was rejected from the show because they said it wasn't Indian enough, and of course he responded to say, are you going to keep us in chains? This is wrong. I'm not a child. And the one line he said was, quote, "Well, I'm not going to stand for it. Indian art can compete with any art in the world, but not as a suppressed art." So this was a big statement in 1958, an Indian making this statement to the quote, white institution. So how his work straddles both abstract expressionism and the Sioux Sublime. I'm proposing that the Sioux Sublime invokes both the dangers and the uplifting. Within the Sioux Sublime, critical judgment. One is not in submission or out of control. One of them is momentarily united with the phenomena of the spirit of the sublime, and in that split-second gasp of awe, or as the lightning bolt as it's been described. Sioux Sublime encompasses the body, the mind, and the spirit as it becomes all with what is called Wankatanka, the great mystery, sacred mystery spirit. The internal and the external create the sublime as this sort of relational together doing. Maybe I'll just show one more. I called my uncle, who's a fluent Lakota speaker, and I said, what kind of word can we use to describe the sublime? And I was describing to him, I said, you see something? It's like a lightning bolt, and it was kind of almost out-of-body experience. I'm waiting for his wisdom. And he says, ooh, I think a Sioux would run. So, okay, so I'm going to skip over all of my Sioux Sublime stuff, but I'm just saying that it's sort of within Mitakiawasin, all is related, all my relations. I'm going to skip through all of my Sioux Sublime because I think I want to write a book about it now. So what I'm attempting to address is the question of this session. Certainly education during the modernist proper in North America was responsible for these not saids. Generations of people in Canada and the United States were educated in ways that disavowed Indigenous people and knowledges, histories, and rights. This appears to be a given now in education. We all know this. We all know that the gap exists, right? And we know that Aboriginal content has been very slim, and we're trying to rectify it. Educational scholar Deborah Britzman's research involving the teaching of difficult knowledge suggests that a shattering of the self to consider what is not learned or taught and the letting go of long-held beliefs in order to teach what is not known or very unpleasant, hence witnesses. So critical pedagogy seems, through critical pedagogy, that there's some sort of emancipation and transformation for society. We hope. And of course, we can just think of Freire when he talks about praxis, who defines it as a reflection and action upon the world to transform it. And Britzman uses the term, which I love, passion for ignorance. And when I heard that, I think I had a sublime feeling from it. I'm like, do we really have a passion for ignorance, right? So those speak very deeply to me as an educator. And wanting to teach these difficult histories, I think it's all about the tone. So unpacking modernity from an indigenous or place of critical self-consciousness allows for new forms of knowledge to flow within the academy, and critical pedagogy begins to take place, replace those not saids. Conversations of ethics of care and responsibility can only enhance our human relations. The need for the discursive within education is extremely apparent so that we can reflect back on our shared history and problems and, shadow these things and grow from it. I'll just go to my ending here. Sorry. Oh, I just said one more thing. Sorry. So, okay, I won't go from this. So what I'm thinking is that, the borrowing of the abstract from Native America, to look at, making this American art. And so what I'm thinking is that they didn't appropriate enough. They needed to appropriate more. Because what they didn't appropriate was that living philosophy of the abstract, right? They didn't appropriate the potlatch. They didn't appropriate, they didn't appropriate these other systems that would have completely enhanced sort of Western ways of being. And so I think that there was a failure in that that modernism didn't appropriate enough. And I said it much more eloquently in here, but that's the gist of what I'm thinking. Thanks.
Can I have Sherry and Dana we have time for about 15 minutes worth of questions. So I'll let our speakers get settled, and then I believe there's a microphone that will go around so that we can hear you on the webcast as well. Any comments or questions?
Primitive art was a choice. People in Africa choose to go a certain way as opposed to our North American, you described it. Another thing, Carl Jung, when he went and studied in Africa, he was invited to dance, and he felt something coming in himself, and he said, I better wait till I get home to do that. But he wrote about the fact that we repress that part of ourselves for whatever reason.
I'm interested, Dana, I love the linkages you make between sort of native abstraction and Newman, and I think that there's a really interesting connection there, and he had an abiding interest and scholarly interest as well as aesthetically. And I know Newman used to call his paintings events, and this was really important to him. And I'm wondering, and I'm seeing it now in Oscar Howe's work clearly, but I'd just like you to maybe reflect on that idea of the event, because for me, all of a sudden it's making this huge amount of sense in terms of how, especially the dances, are reflective of that idea of the painting as event.
Painting as event, or in terms in the abstraction. Well, that I guess it's the not always wanting to use the word spirit, because then people are saying, "What are you? What does that mean?" But just in terms of the aliveness, right? That there's aliveness within those actions. Like this painting here, these are all dancers, and but just the. I guess what the event, invokes through any kind of, whether it's powwow dancing or sun dancing or hamatsa or blackface dancing or Hopi deer dance, all those dances, right? But that, what gets evoked from that. And, I'm still, researching this Barnett Newman fellow. But, I think that he understood that. He just didn't go far enough.
I just wanted to say how refreshing it was to hear somebody talk about R.G. Miller's work, and that alone. And since you and I spoke on the break, I was just wondering, the stories that we told in that last session, how does it affect your read of the work, or your appreciation of the work, or your ability to challenge the work, or what have you? And again, I know I'm putting you on the spot because you've come to it recently.
Well, I have to say that I was completely unaware of that controversy, so just hearing it invoked in the panel before mine made me completely ridden with panic because I'm sure it actually changes everything in a way I haven't had an opportunity to process. But when we were talking before, one of the things that we were discussing is the fact that controversy emerges from a kind of conflict over authority that's very much deeply embedded in ongoing colonial relations, right? So that was something that I was trying to draw out with regard to all of these works, the way in which they position Native people as in a position of authority over representation and meaning, and that's one of the crucial aspects to recognize. There's more to be said about how the controversy affects this work, but I'm not there yet. I'll get back to you. I'll email you.
Just a quick question, Sherry. I really appreciated your close readings of the work. There's just not enough reading of artworks by Aboriginal people. Tend to always put it within the context, spend way more time on the context than reading the works. But do you think your compulsion to read the works affects or endangers the silence and that silent gesture by filling it with words?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm always aware, I have this very strong interest in visual art, and I write about it, and I teach it. My training is as a literary critic, and I'm always very conscious of being, it's ironic, I'm always very conscious of bringing this sort of literary critical approach to bear on art, and it often doesn't seem quite right to me, and I think you're pointing out one of the ways in which that's inadequate. But I don't know how else to think about meaning. Right? I mean, so silence has a meaning, but how do you draw that meaning out without interpreting and explicating? And I don't know. And one of the interesting things about silence in particular is that it can have different meanings for different people, right? And some of those meanings can be colonial. So it's a dilemma. I mean, there's, the challenge of not over-explaining and letting complexity and ambiguity stand, and at the same time interpreting in a way that sort of counters this sort of colonial history of representation and interpretation that I think Aboriginal art is really working against. So I don't know. I do my best to negotiate that contradiction, and I'm sure there's much more to be said, and other people take different approaches. I'm going to ask you, I know you work on silence as well, so I'm going to ask you about that later, how you make silence meaningful without.
I think with Barnett Newman or somebody like that, one of those guys from that period, said, the answer to a painting is another painting.
Mm-hmm. But, it's one of the problems of the visual, right? I mean, the power of the visual lies in part in the fact that it invokes multiple, sometimes contradictory meanings, right? But those meanings can have, again, very different political valences. So how do you let that ambiguity stand, and ambiguity is part of the meaning, without letting the visual slide into what you want it to resist?
I'm really fascinated by this group of paintings. I think that on the one hand, your presentation particularly, because for me, Barnett Newman has always stood for a kind of ideological position in regards to painting that kind of shut the door to many different kinds of practices that did not fit a certain kind of positionality in relation to, of course, the sublime, but also to flatness itself. And so I think that in many painters, Latin American painters, Mexican painters, and of course Native American painters, who were doing certain kinds of abstractions that touched upon but differed completely, really, in a sense, from that position, were left outside. And I'd like to suggest that perhaps what is missing in Barnett's analysis is the notion of time as a continuum, whereas the possibility of the body and time in abstract expressionism is attached to the male body of the white artist. In this work, something happens that collapses time and painting and surface that has to do with the dance. Maybe this is why the dance, this is just occurring to me. So maybe, do you think that maybe there is something to that there, perhaps?
Well, that they didn't appropriate everything. I mean, that was that's their loss, right? That they would have it wouldn't have it would have went beyond body, because I think that's kind of what he was trying to maybe think about doing. I wasn't thinking in terms of gender or anything, because I was thinking more of the idea of this the apparent influence of Native American abstraction in that particular time of painting. And how it's so well documented, like it's there, just volumes and volumes and volumes of the linkage. And then I think, wow, why didn't they go further? Why didn't they go all the way? Then we wouldn't have this kind of late capitalism vulgarities, right? The diamond skull never would have been made. So they should. And I know I'm being silly and provocative, but I mean, it's because we see it over and over, these appropriations of our iconography, some of our ideas, and I think, when are they going to, if they really want to steal, they're not, other than land, of course, right? Like there's, I stop on land, but But if, to really get into the spiritual and philosophical, even just the philosophical ideas of many Indigenous communities, and there is linkages with, how we all view the world and spirit and that kind of thing, and, that, so I've been thinking about these things.
We are out of time for questions, so I want to again ask you to help me thank the panel, and I thank Falcon. Being asked to give the closing remarks for a symposium is a very daunting request, and I've tried to pull a few themes out from the day's events, and if it's a bit of a mess, I apologize. But I would also like to just start with my own experience working on the exhibition at the Belkin. I am of mixed ancestry, Dutch and Métis, and I grew up in a small city called Red Deer, Alberta. And I was raised in a primarily European household, and when I was a student, I never learned about the residential school that was located in my hometown. And working on this project, as well as my path through my education over the past 6 years, has been incredibly foundational for me. And one of the works that I was originally and early very drawn to in the curational process of this exhibition was Joan Cardinal Schubert's work. Joan is also from Red Deer, and I couldn't help but comparing my own experience with hers as an artist who really broke a lot of ground for all of us here today to be able to do the work that we are doing. And I've given a lot of tours of the exhibition, and I always start with Joan's work. And one of the most amazing parts of this installation are the red apples that are on the desks that have metal hooks inserted into them. And the red apples are left to rot for the duration of the exhibition, which is 3 months in this case. And one of the apples at the front of the installation has fallen over, and because of the metal hook inserted inside of it, it has been oxidizing and has leaked this pure black liquid onto the floor of the gallery, which for me is just so incredibly symbolic of the experience of residential schools and the profoundly negative impacts that it has had on communities across Canada. And that image is something that will stick with me as I move forward for many years. Another story I would like to share is from during one of our artist talks near the beginning of the exhibition. We had a woman who works with the Indian Residential School Survivor Society stand up at the end of the talk and expressed her profound gratitude for the artists being there and sharing their stories. And she said that listening to survivor testimony over an extended period of time really caused her to become numb to the stories of abuse that she heard, because they were the same stories of abuse over and over again. And entering into the exhibition, she was overwhelmed by the emotion that she experienced, and that the exhibition helped her to come to that place. And obviously beyond this one exhibition, I think it speaks to the power of art to convey things, as a number of the speakers have pointed to today, that we can't normally express, and that accounts of residential schools through both survivor testimony but through other published materials sort of fail to get at. And I think in the opening remarks from Elder Larry Grant, he really summed that up when he said that Canada is, what we know as Canada is a partial history of facts. And the exhibition and the symposium today, I think, were part of the truth-telling that needs to happen
Questions have been raised that surround also what the consequences of truth-telling are for survivors as well as others involved. Shelley, Rosenblum, and others have pointed to the idea of the artist as activist in the symposium today for their ability to bring about moments of cultural agency in whatever small ways they can in certain situations. Richard Hill described how Morisot's art was galvanizing for him as a young man. And this is the importance of engaging Indigenous art on its own terms, being careful to neither victimize nor fall into commonly cited tropes. In his discussion, Ryan Rice signaled that protocol is a necessary strategy in curation in order to counter the legacy and current reality of colonialism. And we have the image of the two-row wampum from a number of the presentations today as a visualization of this. Lucia explored the contemporary state of exception experienced in the border city of Tijuana and arguably in Canada's Indian residential school system and beyond to the larger context of colonialism, and how artists and others can create their own forms of citizenship that can affect policy decisions. David spoke about the need for Indigenous sovereign display territory and recognizing the importance of everyday sites of refusal to engage with the other, a point that I think Sherry's discussion of silence also draws upon in part. And of course, we have the questioning of the concept and the application of the term reconciliation, which has been really central to our work in the exhibition and leading up to the symposium. Steve presented us with some disturbing images, as well as some images that disturb the image of Indigenous people that has shaped our experience since contact. And this also speaks to how we remember the Indian residential school system in a way that doesn't assuage guilt or uphold Canadian nationalist myths. Charlotte Townsend Galt spoke about performance as both border control and ontological predicament that redefines the relation between performer and audience, a certainly entangled relationship, but one that affects our collective memory and our ability to form new understandings. Sherry spoke about the differences between survivor testimony and art making. And the question that came up in the panel was, does reading the work affect its power, the power of silence to communicate, which is one that I know I will definitely be considering as I move forward. And finally, Dana argues that the borrowing of abstraction from Native American art didn't go far enough. So thank you everyone for attending today, and please keep in touch with the Belkin through our upcoming programs this month as the exhibition comes to a close. Thanks.